10 May 1945, Mindanao. General Douglas MacArthur's commitment to liberating the Philippines remains constant as he orders elements of the 8th Army to land at Makahalar Bay on the island's northern coast. Once ashore, they are to advance south to reinforce the embattled 31st Division along the Sayre Highway. The pre-invasion bombardment provides the only fireworks as the soldiers make the landing against no resistance. Contact is made with Filipino guerrillas and patrols set out to scout the perimeter. On the surface, this assault seems merely administrative, but it is actually the checkmate move in a brutal chess game that has allowed American forces to move rapidly across southern Mindanao. April landings at Moro Gulf on the western coast took the Japanese forces by surprise. Their commander, General Yosaku Morozumi, had always expected a landing at Makahalar and deployed his troops accordingly. Unimpeded at Moro, American infantry of the 31st and 24th Divisions advanced eastward to their main objective at Davao Gulf. The city of Davao fell to the Americans on 3 May, and Morozumi tried to shore up his defenses along the southern portion of the Sayre Highway, the main north-south axis in the region. Engaged by the Americans there and continually harassed by guerrilla units everywhere, the enemy commander was forced to leave the Makahalar Bay area undefended. Adhering to Japan's policy of fighting to delay an Allied attack on the home islands, Morozumi's tactics are entirely defensive. The addition of more 8th Army troops to the Sayre line promises to spoil even this desperate hope. Running short of men, his supplies dwindling if not altogether gone, Morozumi will have little choice but to withdraw his exhausted troops into the western mountains near Malay-Balay. There, as everywhere in the Pacific, the wind-scattered straws of the once proud Japanese army will attempt to survive the twilight of their empire and to await the fall of night. May 1945, Berlin. Victory spreads her wings and lifts the spirits of a shell-shocked continent. Since Nazism first spread like a black stain across Europe, there has been little for its victims to celebrate. Now, amid the ruins of their former lives, the benighted masses manage to raise their heads and dream of a future without tyranny. VE Day, Victory in Europe Day, has finally arrived. An anxious world catches its breath as Harry Truman, Winston Churchill, and Charles de Gaulle broadcast news of the German surrender. Although the Pacific War still rages, everything has changed. Europe will not only have to be rebuilt, but reimagined as well. 40 million ghosts haunt its nations, the grim price tag for a long, brutal war. Many were killed through the cold calculation of the Holocaust, worked to exhaustion, then murdered for their pains. Others died in their very beds as the hellstorm of bombs wreaked random devastation. Trapped between the Axis and Allied juggernauts for over 5 years, the citizens of Europe now know all too well the costs of total war. Since the vindictive Versailles Treaty first set the wheels of conflict in motion, Hitler had slouched inexorably toward this apocalypse. Now the beast is dead, and with any luck, his dark vision of a new Europe died with him. In France, the defeat of Germany has meant a reclamation of national identity. After years beneath the enemy's boot, the French have found redemption in their small contribution to the Allied victory. In Britain, there is sweeping national pride. The country has endured the Nazi onslaught and won. Even in the dark days of 1940, when the Luftwaffe ruled the skies, the British stiff upper lip prevailed. Among the crumbling wreckage of London, city lights once again twinkle in the darkness. On the other side of the Atlantic, the news is greeted with jubilation. American crowds break into spontaneous celebration, and hope is in the air. In less than a year, Eisenhower has delivered on the promise of the D-Day invasion, and at least some American soldiers soon will be coming home. Of course, the soldiers who return may not be the men their friends and families remember. Many will be forever changed by their experiences. Some have witnessed horrors beyond the imagination of anyone at home. They have seen the carnage of Omaha Beach, the inferno of Dresden, the skeletons of Buchenwald. For these troops who toppled the Nazi monolith, the surrender is a welcome relief from combat, though new headaches are on the horizon. The international cooperation that carried the Allies through the war is to be scrapped, and Germany carved into a complicated jumble of occupation zones. The political geography is perhaps even more complicated. Germany must function, but unfortunately, some of the functionaries are Nazis. Since no one wears swastika cufflinks and everyone is pointing fingers, the Allied occupiers are left scratching their heads. Overworked administrative officers charged with the denazification of the government may well wonder if the 1,000-year Reich could yet become a reality. The chaos has left senior commanders little time to share in the celebrations of common soldiers. Spared the responsibility of casualty lists and battle objectives, Allied generals must now chuck their war maps and pick up organizational charts. Prisoners must be processed, jurisdictions maintained, protocols observed. And while dog faces mix with ease among the boisterous ranks of Soviet troops, there is no disguising the chill in the air at the higher latitudes of power. The political winds of post-war Europe are shifting by the second. Although the war is over, the peace could fall to pieces unless East and West come to terms. Up to now, the Allied powers have directed their resources to a single end in the European theater, crushing Nazi Germany. Now that Hitler has left the stage, who will play the villain? May 1945, Okinawa. A disturbing sense of déjà vu hangs over the Allied forces advancing on the Shuri Line. Although the Americans have added another division to the front, and the Japanese troops opposing them are fewer in number, the obstacles ahead are nearly indistinguishable from those they faced a month ago. The 96th Division again storms a steep hill against a steady hail of counterfire from all sides. Only the name of the hill has changed. 3 weeks ago, the Deadeyes were struggling with Kakazu Ridge. Now they contend with the accurately, if unimaginatively named, Conical Hill. The 500-foot-tall anchor of the Shuri Line's eastern perimeter, Conical Hill is a critical objective for Ground Commander General Simon Buckner. Buckner is under pressure from the Pacific Brass to accelerate the pace of the Okinawa campaign and free up Task Force 58 for other duties. Admiral Chester Nimitz, head of operations in the Pacific Theater, wants his boats closer to Hirohito and farther from Imperial suicide jockeys. Allied success is contingent on a breakthrough by either the 96th or the 6th Marines to their west. A breakthrough by either side will lay open the Yaha-Shuri Road, which lies less than a mile behind the Shuri Line. Once captured, this road will afford the Americans a golden opportunity to surround General Mitsuru and his troops. Against Conical Hill, the 96th makes liberal use of its familiar answer to the dug-in Japanese defense: mortars, flamethrowers, and satchel charges. As star-spangled artillery blazes in the background, the GIs probe for a soft spot in the enemy's defenses. Adding to the misery is the onset of Okinawa's monsoon season, which turns the landscape into a quagmire that slows the Americans even further. The GIs reach the crest of the hill after 3 days of intense fighting. Only after U.S. armor strips away the foe's fortifications in a lethal fusillade of fire and explosives do the Yanks gain some badly needed breathing room. It is not over yet. Thus situated, the Deadeyes repel 3 consecutive days of Japanese counterattacks before finally prevailing. 10 days of battle costs the 96th more than 1,200 casualties, with 138 dead. The Leathernecks forge ahead through a flat, 1,000-yard-long killing field, absorbing horrific punishment. But the Marines have not gained their reputation by turning tail when facing adversity. They push on, angling toward Shuri Castle, 3,500 yards to the left and the heart of the Japanese defense. Injury is compounded by insult as, having weathered the flatlands, they come to an abrupt halt at tiny Sugarloaf Hill, where the opposition's network of machine guns and anti-tank emplacements are anything but sweet. Like Conical Hill on the east, Sugarloaf stands between Uncle Sam and the Yonabaru-Naha Road. Breaking the barrier is a job for the Sherman tanks escorting the Marines, but heavy rains coupled with potent Japanese anti-tank resources delay the job for a full week. Only then do the armored behemoths rumble around both sides of Sugarloaf, spewing destruction ahead of them, trapping and scattering the outgunned defenders. The Leathernecks have achieved their goal 3 days ahead of the GIs on the other end of the line, but in the process have sustained over 2,600 casualties. Meanwhile, in the center of the line, the 77th Division and 1st Marine Division are caught between rocks and, well, more rocks as they await the arrival of their own armor. While engineers gingerly take on the job of locating and eliminating minefields, other troops and artillery are devoted to exterminating enemy anti-tank defenses. On 17 May, the steel-skinned cavalry arrives, again pounding defensive positions and serving as bodyguard to the infantry. Though occasionally felled by hostile fire, the tanks tip the scales in favor of the Americans, and the surviving Japanese are forced to withdraw into an even smaller perimeter, their ranks now all but devoid of experienced fighters. With more than 2,000 casualties of their own, the Westerners, too, take a deep breath. They gather their replacements, tend to their wounded, and prepare for their next move. With any luck, one more push will squeeze Hirohito right off Okinawa. Amidst a global Armageddon of fire and steel, each person who approached the gates of Auschwitz was a single, fleeting spark of history. Each person bore the weight of a community, the stigma of membership in a group Adolf Hitler deemed unworthy of life. As new arrivals shuffled from freight cars, SS doctors greeted them as minor gods of the swastika, casually separating the doomed from the cursed. Families were wrenched apart, the weak or sickly stripped naked and packed shoulder to shoulder into decontamination chambers. When the doors slammed shut, 2 canisters of deadly Zyklon B gas were released into the room. Camp inmates removed the bodies by their tangled limbs and carried them to the ovens. Prisoners who survived the selection process were then marched past the smokestacks and on to new horrors. Personal belongings were confiscated and replaced with ragged camp uniforms. Hair was shorn and names changed to numbers. The grotesque irony of Auschwitz, and every other concentration camp, is that the Nazis' only success was the destruction of their own humanity. They can claim no victory in the systematic murder of 6 million Jews, gypsies, homosexuals, and other targeted groups. From Esterwegen to Treblinka, Ravensbrück to Sobibor, the covert killing has been exposed in Germany's defeat. The path to this ignominious end was paved with hatred, credulity, and bigotry. The hatred of Hitler, the blind credulity of his followers, the bigotry of Europe. For when an Austrian corporal crawled from the depths of German society to terrorize the Western world, he did so on the backs of a traditional scapegoat, the Jews. Hitler beat the drums of anti-Semitism throughout the 1920s, pinning the blame for Germany's post-war woes squarely on its most vulnerable citizens. He vowed to create a blue-eyed fatherland purged of non-Aryan races. When Hitler finally came to power in 1933, he was true to his word. It began with an official boycott of Jewish businesses, moved to the revocation of rights, then escalated into widespread violence. Joseph Goebbels' propaganda machine churned out vitriolic lies for public consumption, playing to the worst instincts of ordinary Germans. Many Jews tried to ride out the storm, refusing to see the much darker clouds on the horizon. After Kristallnacht in 1938, even the most fervently optimistic Jew understood what kind of future he had in Nazi Germany. None whatsoever. Dozens were killed and thousands arrested during this night of broken glass, organized by SS security chief Reinhard Heydrich. The next morning, the skies of Germany were filled with the smoke of burning synagogues. The gears of the modern Nazi state were grinding inexorably toward acts of unspeakable horror. Concentration camps rose relentlessly from the landscape of the Reich, serving at first as re-education camps for Hitler's political adversaries. Much of Europe would grovel beneath the Nazi boot heel, but few people had more to fear than the large Jewish community beyond Germany's borders. As the Wehrmacht pushed across border after border, the camps soon proliferated in occupied territories. Death knocked upon the doors of Europe's Jews. They were pulled from the lives they knew and packed into ghettos with strangers, if not simply shot dead. The Einsatzgruppen, Hitler's predatory death squads, followed the German army across the continent like vultures, rounding up anyone excluded from the Aryan master plan. The Jews never had a fighting chance. The first rumblings came from the Wannsee Conference at SS headquarters in Germany. Heydrich, Adolf Eichmann, and other Nazi functionaries laid down in explicit terms the final solution for European Jewry. The victims were to be shipped to the east and exterminated. After several grisly rounds of trial and error, Heinrich Himmler's eager camp commandants honed their murderous technique. Nothing went to waste. Bullets were spared in lieu of gas. Gold was harvested from the mouths of the dead. Hair was transformed into textiles. Yet, despite the efficiency of the Nazi technocrats, the camps were much more than impersonal killing machines. Ethnic Germans were culled from Eastern Europe's hotbeds of anti-Semitism for duty as camp guards. They attacked their job with a fervor born of bred-in-the-bone bigotry, abusing their charges with sadistic glee. Worse still was the more purposeful torture by camp doctors, such as the notorious Josef Mengele of Auschwitz. The availability of human test subjects led to deadly experimentation, all in the name of fraudulent science. Among the inmates, small acts of courage were commonplace, but survival was the order of the day. Tiny morsels of food were like gold and were hoarded as such. Even the strongest of the prisoners wasted away, obliging the intentions of their Nazi hosts. A haunted sameness came over the inhabitants of the camps. Starvation left them as skeletons, blank looks of horror frozen in their eyes. Their suffering continued to escalate, even as the Allies pushed closer to the most far-flung of the camps. As for the executioners themselves, there would be nowhere left to run, and no more time to burn. One by one, the architects of genocide were ensnared in the Allied net. Only a few managed to scurry to the safety of sympathetic shores. For the inmates of the liberated camps, there is no such resolution. The long night of the Holocaust drapes over its victims like a curse. There is no way to go home, for they have no home. No family awaits their return, for their loved ones are now gone. Survival does not mean joy. It simply means survival. A different kind of curse awaits the victims' neighbors, those who encouraged or silently condoned the slaughter at their doorstep. The Holocaust is their legacy of guilt, their children's cultural inheritance. As they enter the camps for the first time, they must look upon the face of evil and reconcile their role in its creation. Their silence today echoes the silence of many yesterdays. They pull the victims from mass graves and carry them in procession to a proper burial ground. The camps will be cleared of the blood and bone dust, but there will never be enough dirt to bury this dark chapter in the history of human endeavor. May 1945, Okinawa. Torrential rains reduced the island's Highway 13 to a latter-day tar pit. Boiling Yankee armor attempting to cut off the southward retreat of the Japanese. American infantry units advanced carefully across the Shuri line, finally broken after weeks of relentless pounding by thousands of Marines and GIs. Allied commanders had hoped to intercept the retreating Imperial forces in a pincers movement along a road spanning southern Okinawa, behind the Japanese command post at Shuri Castle. Unfortunately, the weather has dealt enemy commander General Mitsuru Ushijima a handful of aces. Uncle Sam's tanks and jeeps sink to their fenders in the muck. Cases of supplies and ammo are lugged to the front lines on foot. Without their steel escorts for protection, the 7th Division pushes warily down Highway 13 as far as Yonabaru, but must then wait for its supply line to catch up. A similar scenario is played out on the west side, where the 6th Marine Division sweeps through lightly defended Naha, but cannot execute the left turn toward Shuri. However, General Simon Buckner still believes that his ground forces can catch Ushijima. On 26 May, the retreating enemy column is on the move well south of Shuri, headed for their last remaining defensive perimeter in the Kiyamu Peninsula, just north of the sea and inevitable oblivion. Now Buckner draws a trump card as rainy skies clear just long enough for aerial reconnaissance to spot their quarry. Exposed and vulnerable on the roadways, nearly a third of the remaining enemy, 15,000 soldiers, fall victim to U.S. shells. The action makes for a spectacular send-off for the Naval Command offshore. Vice Admiral Kelly Turner, commander of the combined Okinawa forces, and Task Force 58 mentor Admiral Raymond Spruance get a well-earned ticket back to headquarters before moving on to the planning of the Allied invasion of Hirohito's backyard. In their place, Vice Admiral Harry Hill is told to cash the check that Turner has written. Admiral William Bull Halsey takes the reins of the invasion fleet, renamed Task Force 38. Halsey never went down in anyone's book as a shrinking violet, and upon assuming command, he immediately turns his attention to the continuing nuisance of kamikaze attacks. He dispatches a task group to Kyushu, the makeshift home of the Emperor's Suicide Corps, and pummels the airfield as if to drive the rising sun back into the horizon. Halsey has less luck with Mother Nature. A typhoon, a familiar nemesis to the Admiral, strikes the fleet on 5 June. Tossed like toys in a bathtub, Halsey's boats narrowly avert disaster when his plan to sail around the storm goes awry. One ship is incapacitated, the cruiser USS Pittsburgh, whose bow is torn away in the confusion. Its recovery prompts a moment of levity from a Navy fleet tug. Have sighted the suburb of the Pittsburgh and taken it in tow. Meanwhile, the anxiously awaited end to the impromptu monsoon on Okinawa comes on 28 May. 4 days later, Allied ground units are again ready to push south. First to reach Shuri Castle on 29 May is the 1st Marine Division. Poised for a full-scale assault on the Imperial Army headquarters, the Leathernecks are amazed and relieved to discover the castle all but abandoned. It is an easy victory in a setting where easy victories have been few and far between. The event is a mixed blessing for Buckner. Though elated at the ease with which the castle has fallen, he knows that in this grand-scale game of tag, his troops are still it. They must pursue their adversary onto Okinawa's southern tip, hopefully before Ushijima can set up a new defensive line. Meanwhile, the Marine 6th Division turns its attention to the airfield adjacent to Naha, where a residual force of enemy troops remains entrenched. The Naha airfield and harbor are defended by a 4,000-man naval unit that has ignored the withdrawal order and elected to stand its ground. Making good use of their remaining artillery and large numbers of scavenged machine guns, the disgruntled defenders present a surprisingly daunting barrier to the Marines, who expected a group of only 1,000. Marine General Roy Geiger decides to bypass the minefields and gun batteries blocking the land route to the airport, and orders an amphibious landing to the rear of the Japanese. On 4 June, the 72 Amtraks still available to the Americans land on the tiny peninsula containing the Naha airport. The element of surprise gives Geiger's force an opportunity to claim 1,500 yards of territory and a large piece of the bombed-out airfield. The rest of the facility is taken in 9 days of tedious fighting, involving the now familiar U.S. arsenal of flamethrowers and satchel charges, visiting their own particular brand of fire and brimstone on enemy cave positions as they are found. All but 200 defenders become victims in the melee, with the Americans taking 1,600 casualties. The victory gives the Allies control of Okinawa's last remaining airfield and secures Buckner's rear. The rain and mud have prevented the Americans from intercepting Ushijima. To the Yankee commander's dismay, the final Japanese defensive perimeter emerges on a line of ridges only 2 miles from the ocean. One more star-spangled push is going to be necessary to finish the job on Okinawa. May 1945, Flensburg, Germany. Now that the 1,000-year Reich has collapsed after a little more than 12 years, the Allies turn to the task of bringing the Nazi high command to justice. Hitler, the biggest fish in the barrel, has eluded them. If the Nazi announcements can be believed, he is already dead. His successor, Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, is desperately trying to keep the Western Front open, allowing as many Germans as possible to escape Soviet captivity. Dönitz sets up his administrative headquarters in the city of Flensburg near the Danish border, but he has little left to administer. The decimated German forces begin surrendering to the Allies. By the time General Alfred Jodl formally surrenders on behalf of Germany, the Allies are rounding up his pals in the German High Command. As one British brigadier puts it, the Allies want all those fellows with the red stripe down their trouser legs. Jodl's immediate superior, Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel of the OKW, is one of the first to be arrested. A week later, Dönitz and other members of the new German government are taken into custody in Flensburg. Among them is Albert Speer, Hitler's war production genius. He tells his captors he knows the end has arrived, adding, "It is a good thing. It was just an opera anyway." It takes British troops only 2 hours to round up 300 German officers, none of whom resist. Allied soldiers escort Jodl and Dönitz to a meeting where the top-ranking Nazis are told that the acting German government is dissolved. When he is arrested near the Austrian border, Hermann Goering is a slobbering, drug-addled caricature of the Aryan Superman he has been prancing around Europe pretending to be. He tries to convince his captors to arrange an audience with Eisenhower. Instead, he wins an unceremonious appointment with a detention cell. One top Nazi remains at large, Heinrich Himmler, the chief architect of the Holocaust. Dönitz had dismissed Himmler from the new German government prior to surrendering. He gambled, wrongly, that the move might win him favor with the Allies. Himmler, in civilian clothes and carrying fake identity papers, is detained for questioning by Allied sentries. Despite the best efforts of his captors, he manages to commit suicide in their presence by biting down on an ampoule of potassium cyanide. He is dead in less than 15 minutes. A cowardly monster gone of his own devices to whatever afterlife is reserved for him and his ilk. A British sergeant reportedly buried Himmler's body on a nearby heath. As a final mark of disrespect, the sergeant refused to mark Himmler's grave or tell anyone else where it was. For the other, perhaps less fortunate German commanders who are now prisoners of war, the dock awaits. June 1945, the Philippines. After months of slow progress in the mountain strongholds of northern Luzon, General Walter Kruger's 6th Army seizes the town of Bambang. The Japanese forces in the region, known as the Shobu Group, must once again fall back and organize themselves around steadily shrinking territory. Bambang is the second anchor in a triangle of towns set up to guard the fertile Cagayan River Valley. Shobu's commander, General Tomoyuki Yamashita, designed the defense to protect sources of food for his army and also to hold airfields in the flat bottomland. Kruger's wrecking ball has smashed the southern base of the triangle from Bagayo east to Bambang, leaving only the teetering apex of Bantak to collapse atop the heap. Bagayo fell in late April with the help of organized guerrilla forces now controlling the northwestern coastal area of Luzon. Guerrillas have also made a shambles of Yamashita's supply lines, further tightening the noose around the enemy's necks. Nothing in these forbidding mountains comes easily to the Americans. Yamashita has proven to be one of Japan's shrewdest, least compromising generals in his fanatical willingness to fight to the death. The Imperial Army has consistently held the advantage in terrain and observation. The inland approaches to Shobu's territory are guarded on 3 sides by mountain ranges. The only accessible beachhead is near Apari in the north. Americans push ahead agonizingly up twisting mountain passes and trails that disappear into dense vegetation. The undergrowth is sown with enemy machine gunners who spring up from invisible pillboxes like targets in a shooting gallery. Mortar fire and hand grenades harry GIs as they press inexorably forward, snaking along hairpin curves and scrambling for cover. GIs suffering from combat fatigue, sleeplessness, and the rigors of a harsh environment hurl themselves forward in frontal attacks against one obstacle after another. Relief is hard to come by. Operations in the southern islands of the Philippines have depleted 6th Army resources. leaving General Kruger with a minimal complement of 4 divisions to deploy across his northwestern front on Luzon. Thankfully, American troops have the worst of the struggle behind them, passing through the twin ordeals of the Villaverde Trail and Baladi Pass on their way to Bombong. Now they enter the gentle valley of the Cagayan River to claim the abandoned airfields and pursue the Shobu group westward as they desperately retreat to a last stand area southeast of Bontoc. Like most last stands, Yamashita's is doomed to end badly, lacking even the mad dash of the Bushido spirit. Gone are the banzai charge and the reckless defiance of former days. Stalked by hunger and disease, Japanese warriors face the unheroic submission of their bodies to decay rather than the purifying fire of total war. June 1945, Borneo. The oil fields on this fetid jungle island have been called the Ploesti of the Pacific by some in the Allied command. While this exaggerates the importance of Borneo to the war effort, don't tell that to the invading Australian 9th Division. Storming the northwestern coast at Moara Island, the Aussies clear a path to Brookton and gain a beachhead there against minimal resistance. The customary pre-invasion bombardment by a combined American-Australian flotilla and American B-24 and B-25 bombers gives the Emperor's garrison reason enough to withdraw and concentrate their efforts elsewhere. Major General George Wotton's troops, who earned the nickname Rats of Tobruk in a valiant defense of that North African outpost early in the war, quickly set up shop near Brunei Bay in preparation for a push inland. As the Aussies push up the coast, the Japanese put up only token resistance. The depleted Imperial contingent numbers only about 800 and is unlikely to prevent the Outback's finest from achieving its objective. However, as in numerous other hotspots in the Pacific Theater, these nearly forgotten sons of the rising sun have enough fight left in them to at least complicate matters. The defenses here resemble the obstacles American forces have faced throughout the Philippines. A littering of booby traps, landmines, and tunnel fortifications make the Aussie advance tedious. When the Japanese do strike, they take advantage of the dense jungle cover, shooting from ambush positions among the heavy growth of rubber and palm trees. The kangaroo soldiers respond with deadly force, clearing positions with artillery fire and close-quarters patrol actions. Their way is often opened by air support. The South China Sea is nearly devoid of Imperial Navy vessels, and northeastern Borneo is well out of kamikaze range. The Japanese airfield at Tarakan was the first parcel of Borneo reclaimed by the Allies in an advance action on 6 May, and the embattled samurai miss it terribly. American P-38s and Royal Australian Air Force Kitty Hawks strafe advanced targets with impunity. Within days, Wotton's rats become river rats, making substantial progress by traveling the interior on barges and boats, bypassing land obstacles and avoiding many natural hazards. There are actually 2 enemies on Borneo: the undermanned and unsupplied human foe, and the well-fortified resistance of the island's diseases and hostile wildlife. Although the Aussies are well accustomed to the excesses of dingoes, crocodiles, and poisonous snakes, the giant apes, winged lizards, and the occasional jungle cat present in this exotic wilderness are another story altogether. Apart from the occasional firefight, however, movement is steady in both directions along the coast. By 29 June, Beaufort and Miri are both in Allied hands, and Papar follows 2 weeks later. Village by village, the Aussies go waltzing Matilda through the countryside to the enthusiastic welcome of the locals who have endured much grief at Japanese hands. Most of the enemy goes down fighting, except for those few soldiers whose devotion to the Bushido Code fails them. They surrender or flee inland through the jungle, perhaps becoming prey for pythons or rhinos. The Anglos race to reach the oil wells before the Japanese can sabotage them. To its relief, the AIF wins frequently. Its failures, however, are marked by the columns of black smoke that rise above the trees. The smell of burning crude oil pervades the battlefield. It is a noxious stench the troops will remember for a lifetime. On 1st July, the checkmate move begins. Landing craft bearing the Australian 7th Division bear down on the Borneo coast at Balikpapan on the southeastern side. The going here is rougher than at Brunei Bay. 2 weeks of mine-sweeping have opened only a narrow corridor, and the shallow draft leading to the beach prevents the bombardment fleet of Dutch and American ships from closing to a comfortable distance. The enemy is here in greater numbers as well, over 5,000 strong, firing from pillboxes and hillside tunnels a few hundred yards from the beach. For this, the warriors of Oz take a page from the Americans' battle book, engaging their nemesis with Matilda tanks equipped with flamethrowers and eliminating gun emplacements with satchel charges and grenades. Major General E.J. Milford's men penetrate the first Japanese line within hours, swinging west to the hostile fortress at the hill the Australians refer to as Parramatta Ridge. Although the defenders are tenacious, their redoubt pales by comparison with those on Iwo Jima and Okinawa, and the 7th Division rolls through before tea time. The campaign proceeds in much the same fashion until 4 July, when the Japanese reassert themselves 6 miles northeast at Mangar Airfield. There, the Australians are pelted by enemy shore batteries and forced to dig in for 5 days of bombardment and counter-bombardment. Finally, with the help of air and naval support, the Imperial guns are silenced and Allied forces once again advance up the shore. Meanwhile, the Japanese mount a final stand on the East Coast Highway. The Australians fight conservatively, minimizing casualties, and allow their superior supply capability to wear down the defenders. In a 12-day siege, the Imperial intruders are reduced to pockets of resistance and eventually forced to withdraw to an ineffective position well north of the oil fields. Driven from Borneo and its oil fields 3 years ago, Allied forces have returned like the proverbial boomerang. On 6 August, the island is declared secure, effectively ending the war in this sector. If Hirohito intends to continue the fight on his home islands, the fuel for his vehicles will have to come from elsewhere. For June 1945, Okinawa, U.S. Army and Marine divisions push forward for what they hope will be the last act of the long, bloody drama on this barren Pacific stage, pitting tanks, flamethrowers, and sheer weight of numbers against General Mitsuru Ushijima's 30,000 surviving samurai. The Japanese defenders have organized their stand at the fringe of the island's Kiamu Peninsula, at Kunishi Ridge, and in the Yaijudake and Yusadake Hills. With the 1st and 6th Marine Divisions to the west and the 7th and 96th Divisions to the east, the Yanks employ what General Simon Buckner earlier called the corkscrew and blowtorch method of warfare. The doomed defenders fight savagely from caves and tunnels, inflicting heavy losses against a hellish onslaught of flamethrowers and artillery from the enemy they now refer to as the Devils. Ushijima's line of defense is stiff and deadly, but much less so than earlier in the campaign, when his fighting units were at full strength. The Japanese, now mostly poorly trained second-line troops, begin losing ground on Kunishi and Yaijudake by 11 June. Disorganized and easily ambushed by Americans attacking at night and from multiple angles, they abandoned the hills for good on 17 June. A day later, Buckner watches as a newly arrived detachment of Marines from the 2nd Division takes its place on the southern tip of this island that has seen so much death and destruction. Buckner's observation is cut short by a barrage of 47mm shells from the remaining handful of Japanese artillery pieces. The general is struck in the chest, felling him instantly. Minutes later, Buckner becomes the highest-ranking officer killed in the war. Marine General Roy Geiger steps into Buckner's place as commander of the ground forces on Okinawa and directs the last drive on Ushijima's positions. The 7th Division forges toward the last enemy command post near Mabuni, as inevitable in its approach as the neighborhood bully at 3 o'clock. Still, just beyond the grasp of the Allies, Ushijima makes his final preparations. The end is at hand. The 1st and 6th Marine Divisions break through to the southern coast on 20 June, eliminating pockets of resistance by sealing cave entrances with explosives and overwhelming defensive positions with waves of armor. By day's end, all that remains of the Japanese in this sector is a single hill fortification upon which the Marines are free to expend the full fury of their attack. The 7th overruns Mabuni on the same day and lays siege to Hill 89, under which lies Ushijima's final headquarters. Bathed in 5,000 gallons of napalm, the scorched redoubt is soon stripped of resistance. If the Americans are devils, what they create in the waning hours of this conflict certainly passes for hell on earth. But the Japanese commander will not turn himself over willingly. The mouth of the cave leading to the command post is dynamited shut when the dog faces arrive, giving Ushijima a few more hours to himself. For the moment, the GIs must content themselves with processing civilian refugees and rounding up enemy stragglers. The only division not to reach the southern coast is the 96th. They engage a group of holdouts on the Makabe Ridge in the center of the peninsula, pounding the Midget Mountain with heavy armaments and explosives until the ragtag defenders cry "Uncle," as in Uncle Sam. Although much of the naval support fleet has set sail for base in preparation for the anticipated assault on the Japanese home islands, the residual force endures the last gasp kamikaze raids on 21 and 22 June. The 50-odd suicide pilots who evade U.S. radar pickets and fighter patrols inflict only limited damage on American boats during the strike. But the Gobs will be eternally grateful when it is their turn to leave this seaborne shooting gallery. The overall toll levied by the Emperor's air martyrs is a concern to the Navy brass. 38 ships, including 16 destroyers, rest on the ocean floor as a result of kamikaze strikes. Some 300-plus more vessels, from carriers to landing craft, have sustained damage since April Fool's Day. Almost 10,000 casualties bear grim witness to the persistence of the Imperial Air Force. More difficult to count is the number of seamen who will spend their lives awakening in a cold sweat at the sound of an airplane engine in the night. Meanwhile, Geiger orders the Stars and Stripes raised over his headquarters near the Kadena airfield and proclaims the battle won. He is 24 hours early in this assertion, as the 96th Division is still a day away from eliminating the last vestiges of enemy resistance on Makabe Ridge. But there is no doubt that the Americans are firmly in charge here. Geiger gives way to General Joseph Stilwell, whose task is to put this hard-won prize to good use. Already, a 95,000-man construction force is busily transforming the island into a staging area for the next stop on the Allied Express, a whirlwind tour of the southern Japanese island of Kyushu. Victory here has come at a high price. U.S. ground forces count 52,000 casualties, half of them from battle fatigue and disease. 75,000 dead Japanese bear witness to the futility of their cause. Another 80,000 Okinawans have fallen victim to a simple case of being at the wrong place in the wrong war. The fight has been a longer, harder one than anyone imagined in those first easy days after the Okinawa landings. But the Allies have arrived in Hirohito's backyard, and they're getting ready to come into the house and stay for a spell. When the history of this war is written, volumes will be devoted to the men who conceived it in planning rooms and contested it in the field. But will the story of the U.S. women who have served be told equally as well? Will history ever know the full measure of their contributions to the military machine that has secured victory in Europe and must do the same in the Pacific? Just a short time ago, most people in the United States considered it unthinkable for a woman to join the military. Evidently suffering from historical amnesia, they had forgotten that women have been in the Army and Navy Nurse Corps since the turn of the century, and that several thousand women saw temporary military service in the Great War. But one person didn't forget. Remembering their past contributions, Congresswoman Edith Nurse Rogers proposed readmitting women to the Army in early 1941. Her idea met with a great deal of skepticism from her fellow congressmen. How could a slip of a girl meet the rigors of military service? Would she be up to the discipline, the regimentation, the responsibility? Pearl Harbor made these questions moot. It didn't matter what Congress thought of women's ability to adjust to the military. America needed soldiers. It needed men at the front, not behind desks in the States. Women, Congress decided, could help America meet the enemy by doing the jobs they do best: typing, cooking, cleaning. Throughout 1942, women entered the ranks of the Army, Navy, and Coast Guard. In early 1943, even the Marines began recruiting the fairer sex. As they went through boot camp, learned to march, to take orders, and give them, someone forgot to tell the 300,000 women who answered their country's call that they weren't supposed to be up to the task. Skeptics soon discovered that one woman, be she an Army WWII, Navy WAVE, Coast Guard SPAR, or Marine Reserve, could do far more than it was first thought she could do. Sure, most of the nation's servicewomen have filled military offices, typing, answering phones, filing. In fact, they constitute the majority of Navy personnel in Washington. But don't be surprised if that driver from the motor pool is a woman, or the mechanic under the hood, the parachute packer, or even the technician repairing the aircraft fuselage. Yes, military women have extended the range of women's work. They have also broadened the definition of a woman's place. Navy waves have taught men to fly on instruments in linked trainers. Coast Guard spars have manned navigation stations. And air WWICs have done everything from controlling air traffic to fueling planes. Between 1942 and 1944, women Air Force service pilots, civilians doing a military job, made a place for women in the sky. They ferried war-bound aircraft from manufacturers to points of embarkation, towed targets for aircraft gunners to hone their craft, and performed countless other flying jobs in the States so that male pilots could use their skills in the skies over Germany and Japan. Still, some people don't understand women's vital contributions to the war effort. They even have attacked their character based solely on their military service. To answer their detractors, however, these women would say that they are neither desexed nor oversexed, as they have been variously described. Nor, as the press would sometimes paint them, are they glamour girls. They're just soldiers doing a job and doing it well. Theirs is a duty born of patriotism, as strong as that of any nephew of their Uncle Sam. This is their war, too, and they've proven it repeatedly. With the fighting over in Europe and winding down in the Pacific, the men and women who have secured peace soon will return to civilian life. But as the authors who write this war's history begin their work, will they remember the contributions of military women? They should. When someone asks the inevitable question, what comes of training women for war? They should have ready the answer: victory. June 1945, the Philippines. Parachute infantry of the 11th Airborne land at Apari in northern Luzon, the final act in a drama worthy of the Bard himself. Air Corps bombers roar over the drop zone, and men and equipment stream from the doors of C-47s, descending through layers of smoke to the ground. As the air clears, bewildered paratroopers can only observe the sound and fury and wonder what they signify. There are no Japanese in sight. In fact, the only ones around to greet them are members of the Connolly Task Force, a special combat team of the 6th Army which took Apari unopposed on 21 June. Contrary to reports from 37th Division Scouts and Filipino intelligence, it seems 6th Army's commander, General Walter Kruger, clings to the belief that Japanese forces are retreating in disarray north to Apari, rather than south to the Asin Valley. So while the task force holds Apari, there is nothing for the parachute infantry to do but look smart in their uniforms and strike south to meet the 37th. They encounter a few Japanese stragglers and testy caribou along the way, but find little in the way of organized resistance. Hope begins to grow that the Japanese on Luzon have finally called it quits. Meanwhile, Kruger himself prepares to say farewell to the Philippines. On 1st July, his 6th Army is to be relieved by General Robert Eichelberger's 8th. Although mopping up operations will continue against the Shobu group holding out in the northern mountains, the strategic portion of the campaign on Luzon is over. The same might be said for all of the Philippines. Resistance is dead or dying on eastern Mindanao, Bohol, and the Negros. The fighting has long been over in the other southern islands. Air bases are operational, and Filipino citizens are largely free to pick up the threads of their former lives and attempt to piece them back together again. Victory in the Philippines has been costly for everyone, Americans, Filipinos, and Japanese alike. The American and Japanese forces have lost a combined total of almost 400,000 men. While the casualty rate for combatants is not the heaviest in the war, non-battle casualties have been far worse than in other theaters. The hostile climate and unavoidably filthy conditions account for huge losses due to illness and disease. Battle fatigue and shell shock cases have been particularly damaging. Many Pacific Theater troops have seen action in more than one major campaign and have remained in combat for long periods of time. The end to the Pacific War may now be in sight, but weary American troops realize that the invasion of Japan is likely to call on their last reserves of strength, commitment, and courage. Only when Hirohito's empire lies defeated will success in the Philippines acquire its final meaning. Throughout history, warfare has provided challenges that test the darker aspects of human ingenuity. Engineers, scientists, and inventors may strive to improve our lives in peace, but the demands of conflict often encourage those same minds to frame new means of destruction and misery. Today's soldier must contend with a different kind of weapon, one that lies hidden, silent, and curiously remote from the land that wields it. Landmines lurk in the deceptive quiet of zones seemingly empty of enemy forces. But the unwary tread of a GI's foot can trigger a sudden eruption of hellish fire. Mine warfare on land has grown out of its infancy to an adulthood of complex and terrifying significance. During World War I, mines were laid beneath enemy fortifications by tunnelers and detonated from a distance. In the stagnant nightmare of trench warfare, the combination of barbed wire entanglements and machine guns proved all too efficient in confining the enemy. There was no need for minefields. But the latter days of World War I saw the advent of the tank, a military weapon not yet perfected but well on its way to revolutionizing war. The tank became the tool of blitzkrieg. As German panzers thundered rapidly over Poland, they heralded a new era in mobilized warfare. Anti-tank mines were quickly adopted in the Western Desert campaigns of northern Africa, where there are few natural land barriers. Simply designed, the anti-tank mine is a steel casing containing explosives. It is detonated by a pressure fuse when the tank rolls over it. It packs enough wallop to disable a tank and often kill its crew. The use of mines has become widespread in every theater of the war, especially in Europe. When the anti-tank mines proved too easy to detect, the development of anti-personnel mines became the brutal answer to the problem. Designed to maim rather than kill, their effect on morale is predictable. Whereas the dead are quickly disposed of, a wounded man requires immediate evacuation and treatment, resulting in a more substantial loss of time and manpower. The proliferation of mines has grown on all sides, and the tasks of laying, detecting, and clearing them has become the special province of the engineering corps. By far the easiest part of mine warfare is placing them. They may be sown in vast quantities across fields, such as those the Soviets prepared at Kursk. It is estimated that 4,000 mines were laid for each mile of front in this great tank melee of 1943. In the Pacific Theater, where jungles, swamps, and difficult terrain naturally hamper the movement of tanks, mine laying is concentrated on the few passable roads and bridges. Beaches are often mined in an attempt to ward off amphibious attacks, but preparatory naval or air bombardments are usually enough to detonate the explosives before troops arrive. Detecting hidden threats is sometimes as simple as reading the posted warning signs and identifying the perimeter wire around a field. Once laid, stationary mines know no friend, and armies must guard against blundering into their own traps. However, when it becomes clear that ground, once lost, will probably not be recovered, unmarked mines are often left behind to slow and harass the enemy's advance. Handheld metal detectors are also used to sweep an area for buried killers, but the cagey Italians were among the first to start manufacturing mines with little or no metal content. Engineers, known as sappers, take on the hazardous duty of clearing detected mines. The job of defusing these deadly mechanisms requires tremendous skill, steady hands, and ice water in the veins. It is a task that cannot be hurried, which buys outnumbered defenders precious time. In the effort to speed up the process of mine clearing, tanks have been fitted with medieval-looking devices that operate on the bull in a china shop theory. One version is the flail tank, also called a crab or a scorpion, which beats the ground in front of it with heavy weighted chains. The goal is to detonate the mines harmlessly before an advance of men and machines. Playing a deadly game of top this, weapons experts already have manufactured mines that must be hit twice before exploding. The consequences of war are always far-reaching and haunt our world long after the last gunshot is fired. Now, this truism carries an even more destructive threat. Many of the thousands of mines that have been sown will very likely yield a bitter harvest in peace. Their legacy will not only be the broken bodies of veterans who have witnessed war's violence, but also the innocent civilians who stumble across unmarked beds of forgotten menace. Despite the continued resistance on Okinawa, it is becoming clear that the last of the Japanese garrison there will eventually succumb, and the island will fall into the hands of the Americans. It is with this thought in mind that the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff begin plotting what will surely be the final and perhaps the most costly operation of the war, the invasion of Japan. It is with a mixture of impatience and reluctance that the Americans begin planning this final battle. With the war in Europe over, there is a strong desire, shared by both the military and the general populace, that the war in the Pacific be brought to an end as quickly as possible. Just the same, U.S. commanders are all too aware that this finale will be neither quick nor easy. Besides the 3 million regular Army troops stationed in Japan, all men ages 15 to 60 and all women ages 17 to 45 have been conscripted into a civilian militia numbering some 32 million. The battle for the Philippines, Iwo Jima, and now Okinawa have clearly demonstrated that the closer the Americans get to Japan itself, the more determined and fanatical is the resistance. The U.S. commanders are certain the Japanese stand ready, as would the citizens of any nation, to defend their homeland with their lives if necessary. At this stage of the war, there is little doubt about the outcome. The United States will most certainly defeat Japan. Yet the Joint Chiefs are none too anxious to cast the final die. While doing so is certain to bring this long and bloody conflict to an end, it will just as certainly cost at least 1 million American men their lives. Yet there are those among the U.S. military leaders who are not so sure that the Japanese aren't already beaten. General Douglas MacArthur, who has led the fight in the Pacific from the outset, and who clearly has a much greater understanding of this enemy than any other high-level military official, is among those who believe that an invasion of Japan may be unnecessary. While he is certain that the Japanese warlords will never counsel any strategy but battle to the death, he cautions those in the Pentagon to be alert for signs of conciliation from Japanese statesmen in Tokyo. MacArthur knows that for all intents and purposes, the Japanese are beaten. Their navy has been destroyed, their merchant fleet decimated, their industrial base laid to ruin by constant attack from the air. He and his staff are so certain that Japan is on the brink of collapse that they begin to draw up plans for a peaceful occupation of the country. MacArthur's assessment is right. Despite newspaper headlines and official reports that the war is being won, the Japanese people, starving and struggling to survive without the basic necessities, watching as American bombers fly overhead unmolested and reduce their homes and businesses to rubble, seeing their neighbors dying or fleeing to the countryside, are beginning to question whether or not they are being told the truth. And it is not just the people who are having doubts. The Japanese ambassador to the Soviet Union has been making frantic appeals to the Soviet foreign minister, asking that Russia act as a neutral party in developing an armistice with the United States. Those at high levels of government are beginning to suspect that the emperor himself is coming close to admitting defeat. Still, the Americans must assume the worst. All indications have been that the Japanese will fight to the last man and woman, and so they must assume that invasion and conquest are the only way to end the war. And so the planning begins. Okinawa, the last strategic stepping stone necessary for the landing of troops on the shores of the Japanese home islands, will be the jumping-off point for some 750,000 American soldiers who will embark on an amphibious assault of the southernmost island of Kyushu. Known as Operation Olympic, the attack, which is scheduled for 1st November, will secure strategic airfields and allow troops there to cover the subsequent invasion of the main island of Honshu, scheduled to take place in March of 1946. As they make these plans, as they prepare to send 1 million young men to certain death, there is an abiding hope in the hearts of these generals that they will find a way to avoid a direct assault on the shores of Japan, that Providence will provide them the means once and for all to bring this damnable war to an end without shedding another drop of American blood. After victory in Europe was declared on 7 May, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill was given a rousing ovation in the House of Commons. It is not too far a stretch to say that he is the man responsible for wresting Britain from the clutches of Hitler, ensuring its survival and eventual role in liberating Europe. "This is your victory," he proclaimed in modest fashion. Perhaps Churchill learned the value of modesty in the ebb and flow of his own political fortunes. In the late 20s and early 30s, Churchill was a politician down on his luck. He had served poorly as Lord of the Exchequer in the Baldwin administration. Party switches and unpopular stands on issues from Indian self-rule to Edward VIII's abdication alienated him from the leadership of the ruling Conservatives. It was an unfortunate time indeed to become persona non grata in the arena of public affairs, because he was one of the few who recognized the threat posed by a new political star on the rise in Germany, Adolf Hitler. The Germans, seething from humiliations heaped upon them as a result of World War I, were hungry for revenge and arming themselves to the teeth. As England's nervous leaders dabbled in talk of disarmament, Churchill railed against such tomfoolery from the sidelines. He was all but ignored until Hitler moved into the Rhineland in 1936, a clear violation of the Treaty of Versailles. After Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain's shilly-shallying efforts at appeasement failed, there was clearly only one man for the job, the cigar-chomping seer of European politics, Winston Churchill. Vowing to achieve victory at all costs, he appointed himself Minister of Defense and energized the war machine at his command. Firing off directives to his staff and preparing for the fight of his life, the Prime Minister took to the field like a booming howitzer compared to Chamberlain's fizzling firecracker. When France fell like a bad soufflé and England found itself standing alone on the brink of a German invasion, it was the pugnaciously determined Churchill who squashed talk of a negotiated peace and inspired his countrymen to defy the mighty German Empire. Impudently flashing his signature V for Victory salute, Churchill's brash confidence also inspired America's Lend-Lease program to supply the Allied cause, even before it officially entered the conflict. Churchill was the quintessential wartime leader. Rather than spending all his time in smoke-filled rooms with the policymakers, he believed in being seen. He visited coastal defenses and air bases, inspected the troops at home and in the field, and observed the bombed-out streets of London firsthand. Dispensing his inimitable brand of sympathy and swagger, Churchill became hugely popular with the British people, who dubbed him grandly Good Old Winnie. The English bulldog was hardly infallible, of course. Blotting out the negative side of the ledger is his failed Norwegian campaign and firing on the French fleet in Morocco. Even Churchill's less impressive stratagems, however, did little to tarnish his martial gleam. When Hitler ordered the first airstrikes on London and the Blitz began in earnest, British subjects rallied around the blazing oratory of their dynamic leader.
We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on beaches, landing grounds, in fields, in streets, and on the hills. We shall never surrender.
Declaring the deadly and terrifying moment of Germany's relentless bombing England's finest hour, Churchill's defiance brought the nation through the initial crisis of threatened invasion and turned Hitler's attention to Russia. Eagerly beating the bushes for allies against the Axis, Churchill swallowed his distaste for communism and agreed to aid Joseph Stalin when Germany invaded in June 1941. He continued to woo his most cherished would-be ally, President Franklin Roosevelt, until Japan played the role of matchmaker by attacking Pearl Harbor. Now that he had the powerful ally that he needed, Churchill began enthusiastically hatching plans to win the war. He believed that the key to beating Germany was by opening fronts on the periphery of the theater, thus stretching the enemy's resources and weakening the center for a knockout blow. North Africa, the Middle East, and Italy all figured in Churchill's strategy and, coincidentally, were all prime areas of British political and economic interest. Stalin's armies had borne the brunt of the war for months, and the Premier pressed for direct relief via an invasion of France. The American generals concurred with this bold thinking, but Churchill argued that Hitler was still too strong to chance a cross-channel assault. Using all his considerable powers of persuasion, the wily Prime Minister flew to Washington, securing Roosevelt's agreement to a campaign in North Africa instead. At the 1943 meeting with Roosevelt in Casablanca, it was "Play it again, Sam," as Churchill took advantage of Stalin's absence to offer yet another alternative to an attack on French beaches, this time an Allied invasion of Italy. But by the time the three supreme commanders met in Tehran in late 1943, Churchill found that some were becoming more supreme than others. His alternatives to an invasion of Normandy were turned aside, as Roosevelt did a little courting of his own, trying to get Comrade Stalin's promise to enter the war against Japan. Long suspicious of Stalin's designs on Eastern Europe, Churchill could only be a sour observer as the Soviets were allowed to keep both the Baltic states and eastern Poland. The long shadow of communism began to fall across the European landscape, but Churchill's political prescience continued to go unheeded. He was skeptical of the plans for Poland agreed upon by the Big Three at Yalta in February of 1945, but by this time he was clearly a junior partner. Still desperate for Soviet aid against Japan, Roosevelt dominated negotiations with Stalin, whose grasping went unchecked. With victory assured and all attention turned to the design of the post-war world, Churchill's greatest contributions to the Allied effort lay behind him. Should he ever disappear forever from the halls of power, his heroics in leading England to stand firm against Hitler and his guidance in helping the Western Allies to victory cement his place in history. An early, quiet exit is unlikely to occur, however. At the venerable age of 70, the bulldog still has plenty of bite left. 10 July 1945, the Pacific. The near demise of the once mighty Imperial Navy allows the American fleet to sail closer to the Japanese home islands than ever before. The ghosts of the massive battleships Yamato and Amagi can do nothing to protect the increasingly vulnerable empire from strikes deep into the heart of Japan's war-making industry. Moving with impunity through the coastal waters off Honshu and Hokkaido, Admiral William Halsey's Third Fleet prepares to hit, frequently and ferociously, at Japanese industry, shipping, and air bases. The first strike targets Tokyo. Surprisingly, American flyers encounter no aerial opposition and relatively light anti-aircraft fire. The seemingly empty airfields are deceptive, however. The Japanese have carefully dispersed and camouflaged their planes, conserving them for future massed kamikaze attacks. The Americans respond by bombing everything in sight, and with fragmentation devices, plenty that is out of sight. Bad weather delays further action for a few days, but on 14 July, massive air strikes continue on northern Honshu and neighboring Hokkaido Island. In over 1,000 sorties, Yank pilots sink 11 naval vessels, including the destroyer Tachibana and 20 merchant ships. More crippling still to the Japanese war effort, American bombs dispatched the coal-ferrying rail system between the two islands. As the carrier planes wreak havoc from above, a naval bombardment reaches the home islands for the first time in the war. 16-inch guns shell the ironworks at Kamaishi for 2 hours, setting the plant and the city aflame. On 15 July, Admiral Oscar Badger's task unit continues the barrage on Hokkaido's coast, this time targeting the Nihon Steel Company and the Wanishi Ironworks. This wide-scale destruction of Japan's iron and steel production, as well as the interruption of coal trade between two of the main islands, is disastrous for the empire at this stage of the war. The effect on Japanese morale is a matter for speculation. Tightly controlled propaganda informs the citizens of glorious imperial victories and dismal Allied failures, even when the facts are clearly the opposite. Still believing in ultimate triumph, the people's resolve may only be strengthened by Allied bombing attacks. The truth, when it comes, may be the cruelest blow they suffer. Meanwhile, the relentless bombardment continues. Pilots will be able to hit objectives never before touched from the decks of carriers. And somewhere in the future lies the awe-inspiring prospect of landing an American invasion force on one of the home islands. For many Americans, news and pictures from the war have entered their lives at the local movie house. From steaming Pacific jungles to cold European steppes, newsreels have brought home the dramatic scenes of battle and the fighting spirit of the boys overseas. While military cameramen bravely recorded history in the hot zones, Hollywood has done its bit by producing thrilling features, attempting to capture the glory and grit of battle for a hungry public. More than 500 war movies have been made since 1942. Fueling the imagination as well as the patriotism of American citizens, these movies entertained while they shaped the war into familiar themes of duty, sacrifice, heroism, and the ultimate duel between good and evil. But movies are not only for the civilians. Anywhere a screen and a projector can travel, Hollywood comes to the soldiers in the field and on the sea. War-wise veterans find plenty to snicker at in glammed-up battle dramas, but comedy teams, musicals, and curvaceous starlets provide welcome escapes for relaxing soldiers and sailors. Some lucky GIs even get to see their favorite stars in person. Comedic favorite Joey Brown always gets a laugh in the camps with his infectious grin, while beautiful sirens like Marlene Dietrich and Ann Sheridan remind the boys what they're fighting for. No one is more welcomed than well-traveled funny man and tireless USO organizer Bob Hope, whose troupe of performers brings humor and humanity to far-flung outposts around the globe and injects a little levity into the grim heart of war. Whether it's the Andrews Sisters' snappy swing or Bing Crosby's signature crooning, songs of home are sure to evoke fond memories for lonely GIs. Perhaps no one needs more morale boosting than wounded GIs who are happy to get the occasional star-studded bedside visit along with their Purple Hearts. To their everlasting credit, celebrities have used their fame and their talent to communicate an important message from everyone at home: that the daily sacrifices of the fighting men are not forgotten. Hollywood screen stars have not limited their contributions to goodwill missions and entertainment, however. One of the first to enlist was matinee icon Jimmy Stewart, who served in the 8th Air Force. Colonel Stewart never had a bomb at the box office, but he has dropped more than a few flying missions over Germany. Screen idol Clark Gable, known to millions as the dashing Rhett Butler, enlisted after the tragic death of his movie star wife, Carole Lombard. At the age of 40, Gable insisted on being close to the action and was assigned to heavy bomber crews as a combat photographer. Being a famous American in the skies over Germany carries additional perks. Reichsmarschall Hermann Goering has offered a $5,000 bounty to the pilot who brings down the mustachioed actor, but frankly, Gable doesn't give a damn. With its inimitable mix of style and substance, grit and glitz, Hollywood has kept its pledge to support the war effort. The film community has played its part well, and for many thankful soldiers returning from abroad, future sacrifice and danger, intrigue and suspense will be experienced only in the cozy confines of their favorite movie house, not on the treacherous ground of a foreign field. July 1945, Alamogordo, New Mexico. While military leaders in Washington and the Pacific continue planning for the invasion of the Japanese home islands, on this seared, pitiless stretch of desert, a group of men are about to put to the test a device which may provide an alternative to what is sure to be the bloodiest battle of World War II. For years, American scientists, along with a group of physicists and experts who fled Nazi Germany before the war, have toiled ceaselessly to create a weapon of such destructive force that no enemy could withstand its power. The effort, known as the Manhattan Project, sought to harness the power of the atom for use in warfare. With the scientists being led by Dr. Robert Oppenheimer, the project was divided into 3 separate groups. One to produce a sustained nuclear reaction, one to produce fissionable material for use in the weapon, and one to design the actual workings of the bomb itself. The project has been enormously expensive, but it has also been enormously successful. The scientists and engineers working around the clock have succeeded in accomplishing all the tasks they were assigned. The atom bomb, the most powerful weapon ever created, is now a reality. By throwing a switch, man can now convert small amounts of matter into large amounts of energy. In theory. Before this weapon can be used against the enemy, it must be tested. While all of the equations on all of the blackboards at the Los Alamos laboratory indicate that it will work, it is all still so much conjecture, and no one can be absolutely certain that the atom bomb will not turn out to be the atom dud. And so Oppenheimer, military personnel and scientists, and a few trusted members of the press have gathered here in the New Mexico desert to witness what they hope will be the first atomic explosion in history. The group assembles at a command dugout 10 miles from Trinity, the name given to the actual test site. There, mounted on a 100-foot steel tower, hangs a mass of switches, wires, and explosive devices surrounding 5 kilograms of plutonium. This is ground zero. As the countdown approaches its end and the men huddle in bunkers or lie prone, waiting for the explosion, there is a sense that they are about to witness more than a weapons test. This bomb is the culmination not just of the Manhattan Project, but of hundreds of years of scientific and technological research. As human beings have endeavored to understand and control the world around them, each succeeding generation has taken the knowledge acquired by the previous generation and built on it. By standing on the shoulders of giants, these men have reached a point where they are directing the most basic elements of physical reality to do their bidding. They are about to witness not just an explosion, but the ultimate manipulation of nature. With these thoughts running through his mind, Oppenheimer waits for zero, and as it approaches, a passage from a sacred Hindu text fills his mind, leaving only itself and the vision before him. I am become death, the shatterer of worlds. July 1945 occupied Germany. After utter defeat in its quest for European domination, the fatherland's future is now being decided by its enemies. Allied leaders meeting in Berlin in what is being called the Potsdam Conference are ironing out numerous points of contention between the Soviets and the Western Alliance. The only thing everyone seems capable of agreeing on is that the German people must acknowledge that they have suffered complete military defeat, and that never again will their armies be allowed to march across Europe. To that end, Germany will be divided into 4 zones of influence. Russia will control the east, Britain the northwest, France the southeast, and the United States the south. Germany's military capacity will be completely denuded. Beyond the mere disbandment of the Army, Navy, and Air Force, all clubs or organizations keeping alive German military tradition are outlawed. German industry, whose tanks, planes, and guns fueled the Blitzkrieg, is to be placed under Allied control. Industrial capacity not readily converted to civilian applications will be destroyed. To prevent future German aggression, the entire German educational system will be restructured, eliminating militaristic and Nazi doctrine. The judicial system is to be recast under the principles of democracy, giving equal protection under the law regardless of race, religion, or nationality. On 26 July, with the conference underway, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill returns to England for the general election. To the surprise of Churchill and the world, Churchill's Conservatives go down to defeat. The Socialists win by an amazing 2-1 landslide. The new Prime Minister, Clement Attlee, returns to Berlin to represent England. While President Truman is helping to sculpt post-war Germany, the war with Japan bears heavily on his mind. On 16 July, he receives word of the successful testing of an atomic bomb in Alamogordo, New Mexico. This bit of news relieves him of the pressure of getting a commitment out of Stalin to join the Pacific War. He is now certain that American troops landing on the shores of Japan will do so only when the surrender is complete, as an occupation force. Truman also believes this new bomb strengthens his position in trying to control Soviet aspirations. On 24 July, he offhandedly mentions to Stalin that the United States has a new weapon of unusual destructive force. Stalin, whose spies already have reported to him about activities at Alamogordo, outwardly shows no special interest, saying only that he is glad and hopes the U.S. will make good use of the weapon against the Japanese. On 26 July, waiting to give the Japanese an opportunity to surrender, the United States, England, and China issue an ultimatum, calling for the immediate and unconditional surrender of all Japanese forces. The statement assures the Japanese their only alternative is complete and utter destruction. Japan's military leaders, as fanatically determined as ever, refuse the demand. As the conference draws to a close, Germany's fate is sealed. The entire social, political, and economic life of the country lies, at least for the near future, beyond the control of its citizens. While the new system is most certainly more conducive to a peaceful coexistence with the rest of Europe, there is a sense of foreboding in the mistrust and ill will between the Soviets and the West. Only history will tell if the remaking of Germany will lead to a viable, democratic nation-state, or if it will become the focus of contention between East and West, a fissure in the heart of Europe. July 26, 1945, London. The changing of the guard has new meaning in Britain's capital. The first general election in 10 years has ousted the Conservative Party in favor of Labour, and most surprisingly, England has a new Prime Minister. Winston Churchill, national hero and inspirational war leader, has been turned out of office just weeks after victory in Europe was announced to rejoicing throngs in the city streets. After all the bell ringing and pub hopping was done, the nation's hangover began. With the crisis past, Britons began soberly mulling over what the post-war future might hold. Years of standing in ration lines and wading through the rubble left behind by German bombing has left the population war-weary and ready for change. They consider the party that started them on the path to war, rather than the man who brought them safely through it. Labour called for a new election in May after rejecting a proposal to continue the Churchill-led coalition government until the end of the Pacific War. Springing into action, Clement Attlee and Ernest Bevin campaigned throughout the country, delivering a message of economic empowerment and social security. They spoke of the Conservatives as the traditional party of wealth, class privilege, and anti-Labour feeling. For their part, the Conservatives ran primarily on the laurels of their Prime Minister and derided Labour's socialist ideas and inexperience in government. Results from the 5 July balloting were delayed for 3 weeks while the votes of service people abroad were collected. Savvy political prognosticators in Britain predicted that Churchill's re-election was not a foregone conclusion, despite his popularity. One significant unknown in the mix was the large number of first-time voters who 10 years ago were more worried about puberty than public weal. The older electorate had lived through the results of the Great War: depression, unemployment, working-class poverty, and appeasement. Whatever the factors, Labour won its first overall majority in history on a platform of social reforms. More than the status quo, it seems, the public wants new and better housing, universal health care, jobs for returning soldiers, and a long-lasting peace. In the midst of the Potsdam Conference, Prime Minister-elect Attlee will travel to Germany with new Foreign Secretary Bevin to continue negotiations for peace. Without Churchill, how different the look is now at the bargaining tables of power. Who could have imagined that the future of the world would be shaped by a triumvirate of Harry Truman, Joseph Stalin, and Clement Attlee? Throughout their island-hopping campaign, one of the greatest obstacles facing the Americans was turning the jungles and swamps of the South Pacific into airfields, roads, and naval bases. Completion of this daunting task was given to naval construction battalions, the Seabees. Beginning in 1941, engineers, construction workers, heavy equipment operators, and divers all were given extensive combat training and formed into battalions capable of building anything, anywhere, at any time. All the way across the Pacific, the Seabees astounded everyone by their ability to do the impossible. With the simple motto, "Can do," they competed to complete their tasks in record times. In an amazing 8 days, they converted the mangrove swamps of Dutch New Guinea into an operating airfield. Time and again, the Seabees, whose name derives from the initials for construction battalion, went about their tasks undaunted by the battles raging around them. Their eagerness to get on with the job even before an area was secure prompted Marines to suggest a more likely meaning for the initials CB. Crazy bastards. With their construction tasks completed, the Seabees willingly pitched in wherever needed. On Okinawa, when rough terrain hampered efforts to supply forward units with much-needed ammunition, the Seabees carried the ammo on their backs. Many were killed and wounded, but the ammo got through. Now, with the planning for the invasion of Japan going forward, the Seabees are busy turning Okinawa into a staging area for the campaign. Beside the necessary airfields, the Seabees are building living quarters for some 750,000 men, surveying sites for the enormous supply dumps, and turning Naha in southern Okinawa into a deep-water port. Without the Seabees' efficient construction of forward bases, combat units at the front would have been without crucial air support. Without their ability to build ports for naval vessels, the steady flow of supplies over the vast distances involved would have been impossible. So convinced was the Secretary of the Navy, James Forrestal, of the Seabees' crucial role in America's success, he said, "The Seabees have carried the war in the Pacific on their backs." This high praise is not unfounded. By sweat of brow, strength of back, steadfastness of spirit, the Seabees have done whatever was necessary to keep the drive toward Japan rolling forward unabated. With this war winding down, it is time to consider the heroes of the battle against tyranny. In a sense, all the men and women who contributed to the defeat of the Nazis in Europe and who are contributing to the defeat of the Japanese in the Pacific are heroes. The farmers in the field, the riveters on the line, and the kids rounding up scrap metal for the smelters have all sacrificed for the common good, giving of themselves above and beyond the call of duty. But in battle, there is a different sort of heroism, because in battle there is not just personal inconvenience to overcome, but also the possibility of death and dismemberment, of total sacrifice. To become a hero in battle, it is necessary to put the communal cause ahead of the individual's most basic instinct, survival. As the war ends, hundreds of thousands of Americans are returning home as decorated veterans, the ribbons on their chests barely hinting at their accomplishments. They are, almost literally, the kids next door, torn from peacetime normalcy to fight a war not of their own making. Almost to a man, they have risen to the occasion, fighting not for the glory, but for the good, asking little in return but the chance, eventually, to return home and resume their previous lives. As time passes, their tales will be told. Grandchildren at fireside will hear how they charged into enemy fire, fought without rest for weeks or even months at a stretch, and reached out with a hand of kindness to a continent in ruins. In a war this vast, extraordinary heroism becomes almost a common thing. But among those many veterans, there will be a few, a bare handful really, who return wearing the nation's highest commendation, the Congressional Medal of Honor. The recipients of that award are anything but common. Men whose bravery and selflessness in battle are so great that they demand to be recognized not just by units or branches or states, but by the nation as a whole. In 1862, Congress authorized the casting of a medal to be given to non-commissioned officers and privates as shall most distinguish themselves by their gallantry in action during the present insurrection. A year later, officers were made eligible for the decoration, which is awarded based on 8 criteria: setting a personal example under fire that inspires other men, devotion to duty under fire, accepting danger, saving life, overcoming one's injuries, defeating great odds, taking command, and seizing the opportunity to strike a blow at the enemy. So that the medal will not be denigrated by petty second-guessing, the records upon which the decisions are made are destroyed, but a few things about the awards process are known. Traditionally, it is necessary that a recipient's heroic acts be witnessed by 3 or more people. Statements by those witnesses are reviewed at the division level, and if the actions described seem distinctly and undeniably heroic, the information is then bumped up the chain of command. At every level, Corps, Army, theater, details of the events in question are analyzed, a process designed to preserve the sanctity of the Medal of Honor. Finally, with the facts of a case known and put in perspective, a decision is rendered and a recommendation is made to Congress. It has been said that some men are born great, that some achieve greatness, and that others have it thrust upon them. In this war, the winners of the Congressional Medal of Honor would seem to be all 3. They have been thrust into impossible situations, and in those situations they achieve that which must have been born into them: the ability to recognize what needs to be done and to carry through without allowing the noise of basic survival instincts to break their concentration. It is for that they are recognized heroes among heroes, at long last, marching toward home. August 1945, Tinian. In the end, what the war in the Pacific has come down to is a single weapon that has forever changed the world. That weapon's journey began in the desert of the southwest United States, where Robert Oppenheimer and his band of scientists have labored round the clock on what is codenamed the Manhattan Project. Consider General Douglas MacArthur, architect of island hopping, moving inexorably across the Pacific Ocean. Target, Japan. For 2 years, MacArthur, his armies and his navies have followed now familiar patterns in regaining lost ground: aerial bombardment, naval bombardment, amphibious landing, infantry advance, conversion of key military assets, primarily airstrips, for Allied use. When one island is conquered, it is used as a jumping-off point for the next, and the cycle begins again. In addition, consider Harry Truman. A former haberdasher from Missouri, Truman was drafted into the vice presidency as a political expediency by Franklin Roosevelt, the most popular and influential president of the 20th century. In the waning days of the most destructive war in human history, Roosevelt dies and Truman becomes the most powerful man in the world. Truman believes that Oppenheimer's bomb, used correctly, might convince the Japanese to surrender, making a bloody invasion of Japan unnecessary. On this August day, barely a year after Marines under MacArthur's command took the island, a lone B-29 taxis onto the runway at Tinian. On Truman's orders, the B-29 carries Oppenheimer's bomb, codenamed Little Boy. Little Boy weighs 4.5 tons and should, theoretically, produce an explosion the equivalent of 20,000 tons of high explosive. The target for Little Boy is Hiroshima, a Japanese city chosen largely because it has been little touched by the war. The destruction wrought by the bomb will, Truman thinks, make a greater impression on the military cadre that controls Japan if it is not camouflaged by previous damage. The Japanese, unimpressed by a single B-29 passing over Hiroshima, do not even bother to sound an air raid siren. At 8:15 in the morning, with a blinding flash, the first atom bomb detonated in war explodes over the central city. The aircrew, banking back toward Tinian, sees behind it a mushroom cloud rising 10,000 feet up. "What have we done?" mutters one crewman. A hospital directly below the explosion is instantly vaporized, and for more than a mile around, the destruction is nearly total. 78,000 people die in just a few minutes, and thousands more are so irradiated that their long-term health prospects are doubtful. Word of the weapon's success is radioed back to base and relayed from there through the chain of command to President Truman, waiting nervously aboard the presidential yacht Augusta. Though the loss of life is lower than conventional bombs have caused previously in Tokyo and Dresden, the Japanese denounce the attack as barbaric and inhuman. Truman threatens further use of the bomb, but the Japanese leadership, deciding that what they were seeing could not be believed, chooses to ignore him. Truman's threat is, in fact, largely a bluff. Only one more atomic bomb is ready to be dropped, this one a plutonium-based weapon, vastly more sophisticated than the Hiroshima bomb. On 9 August, a B-29 carrying the second bomb, codenamed Fat Man, flies over the port city of Nagasaki. The B-29 is named Box Car, and at the controls is Major Charles Sweeney. In a matter of seconds, the industrial district where 90% of Nagasaki's workforce labors is in ruins. "35,000 Japanese die on the spot, and over the next several months, as many more will die of radiation sickness." Boxcar, mission complete, is forced to land at Okinawa, MacArthur's most recent acquisition, a safe landing site won with American blood only 2 weeks earlier. Truman again demands the Japanese surrender. Whether the arrogant militarists who hold the reins of command in Japan will listen, Truman doesn't know. What he does know, however, is whatever they do, he has no more atom bombs. August 1945, Tokyo. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, while horrific, are not the only problems facing Japan's Supreme Council for the direction of the war. Since May, the commanders of the mighty Japanese imperial war machine have been despondent. They know that, in strategic terms, Japan has shot her last bolt. The Japanese economy is in shambles. Most of her imported sources of food and raw materials have been cut off. Many of her people face starvation. Japan's proud military is also in a shambles, with the Navy in particular reduced to a mere shadow of itself. When the Germans surrendered in Europe last May, that freed the Americans to intensify their fighting in the Pacific. Since then, American victories have included the capture of Okinawa, a nearby island that is a prime site for launching bomber attacks against Japanese cities. And now the Soviets are adding to Japanese woes. The Soviets had signed a non-aggression pact with Japan, and Japanese leaders had secretly hoped that the Soviets would help them negotiate a face-saving surrender. During Potsdam, top Japanese political leaders put out feelers via Stalin to the Americans seeking peace. They wanted to avoid an Allied invasion of Japan. But Japan's fanatic generals, of course, were firmly against it. They said Japan could repulse any American invasion. Japanese army units could be concentrated at the American landing sites. Japanese Air Force planes in waves of kamikaze assaults could strafe the American transports and their troops. And if the American troops moved further inland, they'd encounter volunteer reserve forces who'd fight them. This ludicrous assessment of Japan's ability to stave off a stronger, better-equipped American invasion reflects how obsessed the generals are with military honor. They talk about a general decisive battle that adheres to a vigorous spirit of attack to set the example for 100 million compatriots. So, perhaps against the wiser judgment of the political leaders, Japan listed the following conditions for peace: no military occupation of Japan, the right to try their war criminals themselves, and the right to disarm their own troops rather than surrender directly to the Allies. The final point is a face-saving offer from the generals. Maybe the Japanese public will think that Japanese forces hadn't been defeated, but had merely laid down their arms voluntarily. U.S. Secretary of State James Burns firmly rejects those conditions, saying only unconditional surrender was acceptable. Burns added that this meant the Emperor would be subject to the supreme commander of the Allied powers. That is too much for the Japanese in early summer. They fear the Emperor being deposed and the elimination of Japan's chrysanthemum throne. The Japanese generals know their soldiers will never surrender if it means the loss of their Emperor. So they fight on. But now, in August, their old friends the Soviets have declared war on Japan. Old Stalin has his eye on gaining the southern half of Sakhalin Island, as well as the Kuril Islands and the old Russian bases of Port Arthur and Dairen in South Manchuria. So 80 Soviet divisions race across the Gobi Desert and over mountainous terrain to push the Japanese out of China. The Soviets are far superior in men, equipment, and experience to the Japanese Kwantung Army in Manchuria, which has only 24 poorly equipped divisions to face them. Many of the Kwantung soldiers are aging or unfit. They have almost no fighting experience. Their equipment is obsolete. The first-rate Japanese troops and equipment headed to the Pacific Front long ago. The Kwantung soldiers are, by and large, overrun by the Soviets, with thousands of Japanese captured as prisoners. Only occasionally does a Japanese unit offer up resistance. The mounting losses in China are then joined by the devastation of the 2 atomic bombs. Back in Tokyo, the Emperor calls his Supreme Council for the direction of the war back to his bomb-proof bunker. The council members argue over what the Americans' term of unconditional surrender, subject to, might mean for the Emperor. It falls to the Emperor himself to make a decision, and Hirohito calls for the immediate acceptance of the Allied demand. He tells his stunned and saddened council that it should bow to my wishes and accept. The next day, on 15 August, Hirohito's high voice of the crane goes out to his 100 million loyal subjects for the first time in their lives via a noon radio broadcast. Despite the best that has been done by everyone, the war situation developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage, while the general trends of the world have all turned against her interest. Moreover, the enemy has begun to employ a new and most cruel bomb. The Emperor told his subjects that he was aware of their innermost feelings about surrendering, and aware it would subject them to new and great hardship and suffering. However, says Hirohito, we have resolved to pave the way for a grand peace for all generations to come by enduring the unendurable and suffering what is insufferable. Several army leaders commit suicide rather than hear the emperor agree to surrender, and assassins make attempts on some of the political leaders. But most Japanese accept the will of their emperor. It is the only real choice they have. For months, the various allies in Europe have been positioning themselves for the post-war world. Much of the pecking order of that world will be decided in the next few months, and if the Russians' primary concern is grabbing and holding as much land as possible, the Americans are proving their endgame mettle in the quest to capture and domesticate Germany's highly successful rocket program. Though Hitler at first doubted that missiles could play a significant role in war, a successful launch of an experimental A-4 rocket in 1942 convinced Der Fuhrer otherwise. Rocket research became the highest Nazi priority. More than 2,000 scientists worked developing rockets at Peenemünde, Germany's main missile research facility on the Baltic Sea. The result of this massive effort was the V2, a 46-foot liquid fuel rocket that carried a ton of high explosives at speeds exceeding 3,000 miles an hour. It was, without a question, the greatest technological achievement of the war. Though lacking a guidance system that would make the V2 an accurate weapon aimed at London and later Antwerp, the V2 was stunningly effective. The Nazis fired more than 1,000 V2s at London, killing almost 3,000 civilians and injuring thousands more. And even as the Allies endured that onslaught, they also saw in it rocketry's almost unlimited military possibilities. After the invasion of Normandy, the American High Command sought to capture German missile launchers, not just to prevent further attacks on Allied cities, but also to secure hardware that could be shipped home for further study. Even before the end of the war, Americans working at White Sands under Robert Goddard dissected, reassembled, and launched dozens of German missiles. Some of the tests were successful, others were not. But the knowledge garnered from the captured missiles helped convince the American leadership that the Nazi V2s could form the backbone of a futuristic post-war fighting force. In early May 1945, the American High Command instituted Operation Overcast, an attempt to capture the German missile program as an ongoing enterprise and transport it in toto back to the United States. Working behind Russian and even British lines, the Americans smuggled out truckloads of research documentation stashed by Germans in caves and abandoned mines. An underground rocket factory in territory to be turned over to the Soviets is looted by American troops. More than 100 V2s are trucked from the scene over Soviet protests. Most importantly, American troops round up and smuggle West German rocket scientists, bagging the biggest catch of all in the southern German town of Oberammergau, Werner von Braun. The visionary genius who headed the Nazi rocket program prefers to surrender to Americans, convinced that the Russians offer little more than torture and death. The United States, on the other hand, had outfitted White Sands with a full range of scientific facilities and is welcoming its so-called prisoners of peace with open arms. In the weeks following von Braun's surrender, more than 300 German scientists cross into American-held territory, reassembling the German research laboratory the Allies worked so hard to dismantle. Though the fruits of the Nazi rocketeers' labors are visible in the destroyed apartment blocks and cratered streets of London, the scientists themselves, in the isolation of the New Mexico desert, will be reunited with their life's work, and the development they started in the name of Nazism will continue undisturbed. Although the war is not yet over, the end is clearly in sight, and on the home front, people look forward to returning to a normal life. But a normal life in 1945 will hardly resemble the life of an average American when the war began. The United States has undergone irrevocable changes over the course of the war, and life at home will never be the same. America has gone from a relatively minor player on the world scene to the most powerful country on earth. As Europeans and Asians face the years of healing and reconstruction ahead of them in the aftermath of this cataclysmic war, Americans are faced with a different problem. Before them lies the responsibility and vast uncertainties of world leadership. They must convert the most productive wartime economy in history into a viable domestic economy, providing the basic materials for rebuilding the world, with all Americans being incorporated into the society in an equitable manner. As the arsenal of democracy, American factories have fueled the Allied war effort around the globe. Under FDR's leadership, the nation's productivity exploded, with tanks, planes, ships, and guns pouring off assembly lines in numbers thought impossible before the war. At war's end, the United States is the only industrial giant whose production base remains intact. The role American women played in the Allied victory cannot be overstated. They readily accepted the challenge of going from domestic housewives to being welders, riveters, and assembly line workers. The enormous surplus of men and equipment created by victory in Europe is beginning to have its effects back home. Factories previously dedicated to the production of tanks are now retooling to manufacture automobiles. Instead of bombers, passenger planes are rolling off assembly lines. While some women happily return to a life of domesticity, many, after doing their part to win the war, have found fulfillment in their new role outside the home. Men, lucky enough to be on the first ships returning home, find themselves competing for jobs with women who, when they left for the war, were relegated to the kitchen. The same can be said for African Americans. The indisputable record of black units in this war stands as proof of the ability, patriotism, and intelligence of the black airmen, soldiers, and sailors. The sacrifices these men have made, the dedication they have shown, demand an equal measure of gratitude and respect. Upon returning home, the black man in America will likely no longer settle for second-class citizenship. As in 1941, Americans again face a future of vast uncertainty. Their problems are real, and there are no easy answers. But if they maintain the spirit and determination exhibited over the past 5 years, Americans may hold in their hands the key to a glorious and seemingly boundless future. August 1945, Tokyo, the world awakens with a start from the nightmare of World War II, just before it reaches its bloody climax. As the Americans finalized plans for an assault on the home islands of Japan, the Emperor's hollow voice rang out over the airwaves of East Asia. The living God has bowed to the demands of the Allies, and victory over Japan is assured. The atomic blasts of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were nothing compared to the emotional shockwaves that now rock Japan. Capitulation is not what pilots had in mind when they climbed into flying bombs with the Emperor's name on their lips. The same goes for Imperial troops who brandished samurai swords against machine guns, fighting to the last man on islands that would be worthless in peacetime. In a nation where honor trumps death and surrender equals cowardice, the population must now make a philosophical about-face. Japan's leaders had been preparing their long-suffering citizens for a fight to the death. Now they must open the door for the devil, and their imaginations conjure a terrifying future of subjugation. On the other side of the world, the mood could not be more different. The city streets of America filled with exuberant crowds, much as they did for VE Day celebrations of a few months before. But while those earlier celebrations were haunted by the persistent specter of the Pacific War, the defeat of Japan has produced an unadulterated joy. In New York City alone, some 2 million people pack into Times Square to roar their approval of the news. This is the moment they have been waiting for since December 7th, 1941, the day Japanese bombers dragged the United States into what had been, up to then, somebody else's war. The memory of Pearl Harbor is tattooed on the consciousness of every factory worker who pounded steel for the war effort, every Marine who stormed a beach, every pilot who daily rolled the dice with fate, carrying death into the belly of the beast. A future looked ominous in those dark early days of the Pacific War, with the Japanese moving like a plague of locusts across the Philippines, Malaya, Burma, and the East Indies. However, with the Doolittle raid on Tokyo and the decisive victory at Midway, the Allies slowly began to climb from the depths of despair. Island by island, sea to sea, the U.S. Navy pushed the enemy into a smaller and smaller box. While Marines burned Imperial troops out of island caves and bunkers, U.S. and British soldiers were blasting their way through Burmese jungles and opening vital supply routes to China. In the later stages of the war, it was less a question of if than when the Japanese would be defeated. General Douglas MacArthur eventually retook the Philippines, and American forces had finally wrenched Okinawa free of the Emperor's grasp. The Allies were winning, but at a great cost in human lives. The Japanese seemed intent on going down in flames and on taking as many Americans as possible with them. In some of the later island battles, both sides hemorrhaged men and equipment at an alarming rate. It seemed likely that Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of the home islands, would result in wholesale slaughter. But it seemed equally likely to be the only way to end the war. Then, as Allied commanders continued the grim machinations of the war's endgame, news came down of the unconditional surrender. Aboard the battleship Missouri, Admiral Bull Halsey had just sent bombers off to Japan when the order arrived to suspend air attacks. A gleeful Halsey called the planes back to the carriers of the Third Fleet. As his fighter squadrons watched kamikazes circle harmlessly over the ocean, caught in mid-flight by the Emperor's order to stand down. The hostilities safely ended, Truman finally grants Dugout Doug MacArthur his fondest wish, a appointing him Supreme Commander of the Allied Powers. The egotistical general finds himself in command of the most powerful fighting force on Earth, but he's not to use it for waging war. MacArthur now must direct all the might of the free world to a single end: a signature on a piece of paper. A piece of paper that signifies what everyone already understands. The long night of war is over. Despite the death of its champion-in-chief, President Roosevelt, the Conference on International Organization opened amid optimism. President Harry S. Truman welcomed thousands of delegates from 50 countries to San Francisco to forge a grand new organization to ensure world peace. It is the largest diplomatic conference to date. Its delegates represent 4/5 of the world's population. Although this busy port is also engaged in moving troops, ships, and supplies for the Pacific Front, delegates enjoy sunny San Francisco, where they are able to walk without fear. Some are leaders in exile, while others have lived under blackout conditions and air raids for months. The conference severely strains the Bay City's overflowing hotels and clubs. More than 1,700 delegates, 1,000 civil servants, 2,600 newspaper and radio reporters, and another 4,500 people, from telephone operators to Red Cross and Boy Scout volunteers, converge on the conference site, the San Francisco Opera House. The 4 pillars on the stage illustrate Roosevelt's 4 freedoms: freedom of expression, freedom of worship, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. The name the United Nations is unanimously approved, honoring the late president who originally proposed it. Most of the big organizational questions were tackled by the major Allied powers last fall during the Dumbarton Oaks Conference in Washington, D.C. Representatives from the United States, the United Kingdom, China, and the Soviet Union agreed on the aims, structure, and function of a world organization. At Yalta earlier this year, Stalin, Churchill, and the then ailing Roosevelt reiterated their resolve to establish, among the Allies, a general international organization to maintain peace and security. Nonetheless, a cloud of controversy hangs over the conference. Fueled by mutual mistrust between the Soviets and their Western allies, the British and the Americans, the delegates struggled to resolve some difficult issues. One is a Soviet demand for extra votes in the new organization's General Assembly. The Soviets fear this new organization will be used against them and want to avoid being outvoted. Other countries argue against giving the Russian bear any extra clout. They complain about the Moscow-backed government running Poland. And some of the Latin American countries grumble about the Soviets blocking Argentina from membership. Argentina, however, has a bit of a public relations problem. Its regime traded with Nazi Germany throughout the war. Another contentious issue shadowing the San Francisco conference is the new organization's Security Council. It is composed of 5 permanent members: the Soviets, the British, the Americans, the Chinese, and now the French, plus 6 rotating delegates from other countries. The Security Council is to have the authority to use any means necessary, including military force, to maintain international peace and security. But the proposal also gives the 5 permanent members veto power over any Security Council action, and no one can agree on how that veto power will be used. Meanwhile, haunted by the failure of the League of Nations, the U.S. Department of State has invited representatives of 42 civic organizations ranging from the Kiwanis and the American Bar Association to the Grange and the NAACP to attend. The hope is that their participation will foster a groundswell of political support for the fledgling UN. The State Department wants to avoid a repeat of its experience with the League of Nations, particularly the U.S. Senate's refusal to support the League and endorse its covenant. League of Nations officials are at this conference, but they are relegated to the background. They have back row seats and second-rate hotels, and their input is limited mostly to informal comments. The representatives of these 42 civic organizations acting as citizen consultants receive far more attention. They use it to create a new initiative to add to the UN Charter provisions for respecting human rights. The philosophy is that world peace and security also flow from respecting basic human rights, equal rights, and the right of a people to self-determination. It opens the way for individuals and groups to challenge their government for social, economic, and political justice, and to have the world's support in those challenges. Some of America's allies are less than thrilled with this new initiative. The Soviets naturally are disinclined to favor these proposals, since their government emphasizes the collective good over individual rights. In addition, the Soviets know that Stalin has put to death millions back home. The British also are unenthusiastic about the human rights proposals because they fear its implications for their empire. Talk of basic rights for everyone, self-determination and democracy could undermine British authority in Commonwealth countries such as India, for example. Even in other Western democracies, support for the human rights initiatives is lukewarm at best. That's because those delegates believe their countries are facing more pressing economic and social issues as the war winds down. But the citizen consultants and the U.S. delegation persist in fighting for these American ideals to be incorporated into the Charter. Eventually, the conference agrees to elevate the new organization's Economic and Social Council to a level equal with the Security Council and the General Assembly. They also change the wording of the preamble, eliminating phrases such as the high contracting parties to something closely resembling the wording in the U.S. Constitution. The Charter now reads, "We the peoples of the United Nations," and it goes on to promise that the new organization will reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights, promote equal rights among men and women, and foster social progress and better standards of life. Above all, the new United Nations promises to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, which twice in our lifetime has brought untold sorrow to mankind. To September 1945, Tokyo Bay. Emperor Hirohito's humiliated minions climb aboard the battleship Missouri for the final indignity of World War II. General Yoshijiro Umetsu and Foreign Minister Mamoru Shigemitsu have been tapped to sign the Articles of Surrender, thus signaling the beginning of the Allied occupation of Japan. Shigemitsu is in many ways the walking personification of his battered nation. The frail statesman with his ill-fitting wooden leg must struggle even to reach the signing table. Likewise, the civilian population now struggles to survive amid the urban devastation of Japan, so savaged by Allied bombers. The intransigence of their wartime leaders brought the wrath of the world down upon them, and now the civilian society looks to rebuild itself upon a foundation of rubble. Many of the men responsible for this carnage have already taken their own lives. The rest of the Imperial Armed Forces have laid down their weapons and live on in disgrace. The deck of the Missouri is filled with these fallen warriors who take their places behind General Umetsu. Across from them stand the victors, headed by the newly appointed Supreme Allied Commander Douglas MacArthur. Dugout Doug may be an Army general, but the location of the surrender drips with symbolism. With the exception of fighting in China and Burma, the war with Japan was one of oceans and islands, and this floating ceremony is a nod to the dominance of the U.S. Navy. Admiral Chester Nimitz, architect of many American naval victories, was MacArthur's equal in this great conflict and also his opposite. The affable admiral has made no hay from the Allied victory, unlike his Army counterpart, who is among the greatest self-promoters ever produced by West Point. Both men are to sign the surrender documents. For two other officers in attendance, this ceremony carries the added weight of personal vindication. British General Arthur Percival and American General Jonathan Wainwright had been guests of the Japanese in Manchuria. Forced to endure the torture and privation that characterized enemy POW camps, they are now ghosts of their former selves, both physically and emotionally. Percival can look across the deck of the Missouri and back in time to see his own 1942 surrender in Singapore. Wainwright carries the guilt of his unavoidable capitulation in the Philippines, leading to the torturous deaths of many who served under him. It was MacArthur who left Wainwright to twist in the wind on Bataan, and it will be MacArthur who exacts the ultimate retribution for his friend's fate, an unqualified admission of defeat from the enemy. The top-hatted Shigemitsu takes his place at the table and signs away Japan's right to self-determination. The jackbooted Umetsu follows soon after, and the papers are handed back to the Allies. One by one, representatives of the broad coalition step forward to put their stamp on history. And just like that, the war is finally, formally over. As the Japanese depart in defeat, they have to wonder what fate awaits their island nation. What conditions will arise from this unconditional surrender? Will the Americans rule the Japanese as ruthlessly as they fought them? They needn't wait long for their answers. The American occupiers are ready to set up shop among the bomb craters of Tokyo, to steer this once fierce enemy into an era of demilitarization and democracy. If everything goes as planned, the Allies will take a wounded nation and transform it into a monument to peace. Yet before this devastating war can be put to rest, it must be dissected. The leaders of the Axis powers must be held accountable. Crimes must be investigated. The dead must be counted and mourned. In the end, the haze of history will obscure these years of cruelty and terror and allow the world to heal. As this war recedes into memory, what will live on in the public mind are the pictures, still and in vivid motion, that have been captured by combat photographers. Though combat photography is nothing new, this war, as none before it, has been driven and documented by motion pictures. Adolf Hitler and his supporters rose on a tide of epic filmmaking, dressing up the seedy degeneracy of Nazism in black ties for its public coming out. When Hitler's vision became real enough to throw the world into flames, among the volunteers flocking to recruiters was a generation of filmmakers. They knew better than any in government or the military that the battle for the world's eyes would be as important in World War II as the battle for acreage had been in World War I. And they saw their job not as the creation of propaganda, but as the dissemination of a great truth, the nobility of the Allied cause and the sureness of its victory. Perhaps less visionary was the American War Department, which assigned the vast majority of photographers to prosaic tasks like battle damage assessment, microfilming mail, and making training films. But those photographers assigned to actual combat took it upon themselves to look at the war from a wider angle, in the process convincing a hesitant bureaucracy that history was as worthy a client as the war effort. Though the newsreel companies dispatched their own private crews to document many of the news events surrounding the war, the vast majority of combat footage was gathered by photographers collecting only military pay. Assigned in teams of 3, still photographer, motion picture photographer, and driver, the combat photographers fanned out over the war. Their credentials granted them access and mobility unprecedented in wartime. They worked under the most dire conditions, in many cases right on the front lines, forced by their craft to ignore the natural urge to flee from danger. They carried rifles along with their cameras, fighting and sometimes dying in their quest. They rendezvoused daily with couriers, shipping the exposed film off without much chance of ever seeing their own work, feeling at times as if they were risking their lives for nothing. They could not have been more wrong. As the war progressed, the public hunger for information required that images shuttle around the world with previously unheard-of speed. A photograph taken during an assault on Sicily might appear on the front page of a New York newspaper in 48 hours, carried by a combination of airplane and radio waves across a continent and an ocean. Movie houses converted to 24-hour all-newsreel formats. Film freshly arrived from the front went into the projector without preview, and the latest imagery from Normandy and the Philippines was the hottest ticket in town. War documentaries were nominated for and won Academy Awards and became the dominant means by which the public came to know the experience of the war. Now that the participants are getting on with their lives, the memory of the war will fade and eventually blow away. But living forever, bringing the reality of the Second World War to the generations to come, will be the work of the largely anonymous combat cameraman. Peace, a word that has been celebrated by ecstatic crowds in the streets and grateful soldiers returning from duty. Peace, an idea discussed by generals and presidents and premiers around the bargaining tables of the world. Peace. For a fortunate few, it brings back stability and prosperity. But for millions more, it simply renews the struggle for survival, for a home, for the mending of families that have been scattered and broken asunder. The losses, which can never be made up, lie beneath fields of white crosses, rest unknown in heaps and common graves, or have been dispersed into an oblivion of white smoke and ashes. The human toll of this war awes and confounds the imagination. In the Soviet Union alone, death estimates run as high as 20 million. This is the horrifying harvest of battles lost and won, murdered civilians, forced labor, and deprivation. Poland ranks high on the lists of Eastern European blight, having lost a staggering 20% of its pre-war population. At least half of that total are Jews who died in concentration camps. Falling beneath war's swinging scythe like withered grass, 1 out of every 10 Yugoslavians died during German occupation. Not only was there a fierce partisan resistance, but bitter ethnic rivalries boiled over to add to the bloodshed. The numbers from Western Europe are scarcely better. Germany sacrificed 4 million soldiers on the altar of Hitler's 1,000-year Reich. Civilian casualties mounted to nearly 1 million as a result of bombing raids and Nazi reprisals against their own countrymen. Occupied France suffered twice as many civilian deaths as military, and across the Channel, Britain, combined with its commonwealths and colonial possessions, counted nearly 250,000 deaths in battle, while bombs killed another 60,000 citizens. The United States never had to face the terrors of occupation, invasion, or ceaseless air attack, and thus suffered no direct civilian casualties. However, Nearly 300,000 American servicemen died fighting in both the European and Pacific theaters of the war. Japan lost approximately 2 million persons in its ferocious push to conquer the Pacific and Southeast Asia. China's death toll, however, remains a matter for speculation. Between its bitter civil war and Japanese occupation, some have placed the figure as high as 15 million. For soldiers lucky enough to have survived, the transition to civilian life has been difficult. But in many war-torn countries, it is not even possible. Whole populations have been forcibly expelled from their homelands, and thousands of war prisoners remain in foreign camps. Much of Europe lies in ruins, with more than 3 million homes in Germany and 6 million in Russia destroyed. Crude monuments of rubble are often the sole evidence of towns and villages that once thrived as cultural and commercial centers. Larger cities such as Warsaw, Berlin, and Budapest were smashed by bombs and must be completely rebuilt. In the fire-bombed cities of Dresden and Hamburg, crumbled buildings and unrecovered bodies form the tragic understory of the new cities that will be built on top of the old. Japan, with its fragile paper-walled homes, was especially susceptible to widespread destruction. Even before Hiroshima and Nagasaki were flattened by the unleashed power of atomic weapons, the relentless firebombing of Japan's largest urban centers had burned out 60% of the total ground area. Industry and agriculture in Europe are almost at a standstill. So much damage has been done that production levels cannot hope to meet the demands for food, clothing, and shelter. Even though more German industry survived than the Allies would have thought possible, transporting those goods is next to impossible. The infrastructure of the European continent is a shambles of blasted bridges, pitted roads, and twisted rails. Some ports, such as Toulouse, have been made impassable due to the scuttled ships in the harbor. More than 3/4 of the bridges in occupied Germany have been destroyed. Coal production, the fuel that fires Europe's industry, is at 42% of its pre-war level. These material lacks in food and provisions merely prolong the war's suffering. As typhoid and dysentery epidemics run rife, rationing continues and the black market expands. Germany and many other nations have been reduced to a cigarette currency, where even the abandoned butts on the sidewalks are harvested like precious metals to buy an extra crust of bread or a pair of shoes. As early as 1943, the United States began preparing for the crisis that would arise after the war. The United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration was formed to deal with these problems, but the scale is overwhelming. The rest of the hungry and destitute world now seems to depend on the economic might of the United States, as it is industrially more productive than every other nation combined. No matter how many relief planes and food boats arrive from America, however, there is not enough to go around. Long ration lines fighting in the streets and the despair etched into the faces of the young are familiar scenes to occupying forces and aid workers. The dispossessed and hungry look to the United States for relief and guidance in the dark days ahead. As the Iron Curtain slams down on much of Eastern Europe and communism begins to seep into Asia, American democracy strives to shed its beacon light on countries struggling for self-determination and the preservation of its people. The monumental expense of blood and spirit that achieved victory and suffered ignominious defeat provides a dark inheritance for generations to come. In the midst of uncertainty and loss, there is only one hope, one light, one guide for the road that lies ahead: the promise of peace. World War II, the most horrific conflict in history, has touched lives all over the globe. Millions have coped with death, famine, and destruction as part of their daily existence. And while everyone's first priority is to return to a peaceful life, there is a consensus that those who led the world into the turmoil of war and those who used that war as an excuse to commit heinous criminal acts must be held accountable. To that end, the Allies have indicted those men in both Germany and Japan whose unquenchable thirst for power and twisted vision of racial superiority led to the utter devastation of Europe and Asia. In Germany, the German High Command, the SS and SA, the Nazi Party leadership, the Gestapo, and the Reich Cabinet are all indicted, as are 21 individuals whose pivotal roles in Germany's quest for European domination is undeniable. Chief among these is Hitler's right-hand man, Hermann Göring. Göring's influence within the Nazi Party and the German military was unrivaled. From the Nazis' early days in Munich beer halls to their brutal subjugation of nearly all Europe, Göring did whatever was convenient or advantageous at the time without regard for human life. Among the others indicted are General Wilhelm Keitel, Chief of the German High Command, Admiral Karl Dönitz, Chief of the German Navy, Rudolf Hess, Deputy Führer, and Joachim von Ribbentrop, the Nazi Foreign Minister. All the defendants faced the same 4 charges: conspiracy to commit crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. The evidence accumulated by the prosecutors is impressive in both quantity and scope. Much of it is from the Nazis' own files, captured by the Allies in the closing days of the war. Documents, photographs, and motion pictures all tell the story of a ruthless, sadistic regime bent on the conquest of Europe and the extermination of its Jews. Göring recoils upon seeing the motion pictures of the concentration camps. He admits the camps were initially his idea, but only to re-educate political prisoners. He claims Himmler was in charge of the camps since 1934 and that he, Hitler's most trusted aide, had no idea such terrible things took place. Day after day, the tribunal, made up of representatives of the United States, Great Britain, France, and the Soviet Union, perused the massive amount of evidence. The Germans uniformly disavow any knowledge of the atrocities and claim that in waging their aggressive war, they were only following orders. The world is left unconvinced, and after almost 11 months of testimony, on the afternoon of 1st October 1946, the tribunal announces its verdicts. 3 defendants are acquitted. 4 are sentenced to various terms of imprisonment, and 11, including Göring, Ribbentrop, and Keitel, are sentenced to death by hanging. In Japan, preparations are also underway to seek justice against those responsible for Japan's transgressions. On 19 November 1945, General Douglas MacArthur orders the arrest of 11 Japanese war leaders. Chief among them is General Hideki Tojo. As the principal proponent of Japanese expansionist policy, Tojo was responsible for Japan's ruthless drive across China and the Pacific. After a failed suicide attempt, Tojo is taken into custody and placed in prison to await his trial. Unlike his Nazi counterparts, Tojo readily accepts responsibility for Japan's wartime activities. Also taken into custody in Manila is General Yamashita, the Tiger of the Philippines. Under his supervision, Japanese troops brutally raped, murdered, and tortured Filipino civilians, burning their villages as they went. He was also responsible for the mistreatment and murder of prisoners of war during the infamous Bataan Death March. Yamashita, like the German general, argues that he was only acting under orders from his superiors. So as the Nuremberg trials conclude and the trials in Japan are ready to begin, the Allies have taken an important step forward in reaping a measure of justice for a war-torn world. An example has been set for all people to see, that those responsible for aggressive war will be held responsible, and that there are lines which cannot be crossed, acts of barbarism which will not be tolerated, even in wartime. Peace. With the cessation of hostilities in Europe and the Pacific, the hopes and prayers of millions of people the world over have been answered, and for the first time in years there is cause for celebration. The future, for so long uncertain, now shines with possibilities for a new and better world. Having been absent for what seems like an eternity, hope once again returns to the hearts of those who have survived mankind's darkest hour. It is human nature to try and cull good from even the most dreadful circumstances, to seek solace in the idea that their toil and anguish have not been meaningless. So it is with World War II. Any event that demands such tremendous sacrifice that irrevocably alters the lives of individuals and mankind as a whole, by its nature, demands the question, why? What possible circumstance would compel the people of the world to engage themselves in such a brutal and agonizing exercise? And those who ask these questions, now and in the years to come, will find the answers in the dark days before the war, in the shadow of a swastika, and in the passionate heat of the rising sun. It is perhaps the ultimate irony, yet one that is repeated again and again throughout the history of mankind, that often the only way to achieve peace is to wage war. When all other options evaporated and the magnitude of the evil embodied by the enemy became apparent, Joe the mechanic, Will the barber, Fred the butcher, and thousands like them all sought to do their part in ridding the world of this pestilence. What can be said of these common men thrust into dangerous, often hopeless situations, asked by the people of the world to deliver them from the clutches of tyranny? Courage, valor, mettle, gallantry, fortitude, selflessness. These are merely words, inadequate in their ability to ascribe to these veterans the true depth of spirit that was required to succeed in their given task. While the people of the Western cultures were aghast at the single-minded sacrifice of the Japanese kamikaze, they failed to recognize that in battles large and small, they demanded the same of their soldiers. These men were asked time and again, as they stood facing their own demise, to lift their feet and march forward, to rush headlong into certain death, and, if they succeeded in beating it back, to take up pursuit until once again they stood facing the dark shadows of their own mortality. It is unfortunate but true that war is indiscriminate, And in World War II, the lines of sacrifice were obliterated, with civilians suffering and dying in greater numbers than those in uniform. Tipping the scale in this tragic equation, no doubt, was the virulent hatred that fueled the actions of the aggressors, including acts of carnage against the innocent so repugnant that man's concepts of cruelty and inhumanity shall forever be altered. Those left alive, many too young to understand the whys and wherefores of the nightmare they have endured, will bear scars both physical and emotional for the rest of their lives. Peace. The final shot has been fired, and the final rifle laid down, and the vanquished has delivered unto the victor that which is his. Those who lived through it can never be as they were. Too much has been given away, both in body and spirit. Those who follow will be unable to escape its touch if for no other reason than that our understanding of human conduct, both righteous and malevolent, has been irrevocably changed. And what of the questions raised by the war? It is perhaps better left to historians to argue the fine points. For the moment, all that is certain is that there was an armed conflict that engulfed the world, that 50 million people lost their lives in the course of that struggle, and that, at its end, the world was a safer and better place than when it began. As the people of the world heave a collective sigh and turn their backs on World War II, as they prepare to rebuild their homes and lives, there is a sense that they stand at a portal in history, perched on the dividing line between one age of mankind and another. And with that sense comes an exhilaration, a rush of excitement at being alive, a singular human experience. For those who step out of the darkness to stand squinting into the sunrise, it seems certain that despite all that has passed before and all that is sure to follow, there has never been a moment in time such as there was as the world welcomed the dawn of this new day.
A sensational disaster unrevealed during the war. The British battleship Barham is torpedoed, capsizes. "800 men perish when the magazines explode. Hitler's most terrifying secret weapon, the V-2 rocket, is disclosed. Jet-propelled, the V-2 rises faster and faster until a speed of 50 miles a minute is attained. And no defense against it has been discovered. Another V-2 is launched, a weapon that just 1 year earlier might have changed the entire course of the war. A funeral train rolls slowly past the grief-stricken people of a little town in America. And all over the freedom-loving world, hearts are bowed. All that is mortal of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, 4 times President of the United States, leaves Washington. Vice President Harry S. Truman takes the oath of office on April 12, 1945, and succeeds to the presidency. At Hyde Park, New York, it is a soldier's funeral, with all honors to the nation's departed commander-in-chief. The last flaming hours for a doomed city. Berlin, once mighty metropolis of a proud nation, now crumbles under the merciless pounding of Russian artillery. The senseless last stand of the Nazis results only in complete devastation. Nazism comes to an ignoble end. General Dwight D. Eisenhower treasures a gift of the pens the Nazis used in surrendering. In Berlin, Eisenhower arrives to attend a momentous meeting which determines the zones of occupation in Germany. General Montgomery signs for Britain. Zhukov signs the agreement for the Soviets. General Eisenhower signs for the United States. It is a proud moment for Winston Churchill, Prime Minister of Great Britain, as he reviews the victorious Canadian and British troops in Berlin. President Truman, flying to Germany for an Allied conference, salutes an American division. At Potsdam, the President reviews the Army of Occupation, where once the Kaiser's legions paraded.
If we can put this tremendous machine of ours, which has made this victory possible, to work for peace, we can look forward to the greatest age in the history of mankind. That's what we propose to do.
The flag that flew over the Capitol at Washington on the day of Pearl Harbor is raised at Potsdam. Victory echoes across a thankful Europe as Parisians turn out in holiday mood and General de Gaulle pays tribute to the undying spirit of liberty. Holland is liberated by Canadian armies amidst wild rejoicing. Not even joy over liberation can shake their determination to mete out swift justice. The Dutch relentlessly round up collaborators and quislings. In Copenhagen, General Montgomery is wildly cheered. And the Danes' heroic King Christian, who never surrendered to the Nazis, receives a tremendous ovation. In Oslo, Norway, Crown Prince Olaf joins in the celebration. Rudolf Hess, third-ranking Nazi before his spectacular flight to Britain, is held for trial. Field Marshal Hermann Goering loses his sidearms and all his arrogance when captured by the American Army. Field Marshal von Rundstedt, he advocated the elimination of enemy people by starvation. Marshal Henri Pétain of France is tried in Paris as a traitor, and only his advanced age saves him from a firing squad. The hated collaborator Pierre Laval goes on trial, and his arguments fall on deaf ears. Swift French justice condemns him to be executed. In Manila, the Jap General Yamashita faces a military court of 5 American generals. Revolting crimes are charged against him. One of the greatest scenes in American history is filmed on Iwo Jima by a daring cameraman. On the costly battlefields of Okinawa, the final campaign against Japan is fought to a finish. Signal Corps, Marine, and Air Force cameramen follow the 10th Army into the Oroku Peninsula in their final mopping up drive that smashes the remnants of once powerful Jap forces. The atomic bomb explodes over Nagasaki, Japan. The Japs were ready to sue for peace when this one bomb wiped the city off the map, with reverberations felt politically in every capital of the world. Nagasaki, viewed from the air, is just one tremendous area of ruin. The unconditional surrender of Japan on board the USS Missouri. General MacArthur gives one pen to General Wainwright, the other to Britain's General Percival, an historic moment for all the United Nations. first American occupation troops to enter Tokyo, the famed 1st Cavalry Division, liberators of Manila. The American Embassy, fortunately undamaged amidst the bomb-smashed city, is the headquarters of the Supreme Allied Commander, General Douglas MacArthur. He arrives accompanied by Admiral Halsey, famed commander of the 3rd Fleet. The same flag that flew over Rome and Berlin is raised over Tokyo. At the Korea Naval Base, the Japs have their Pearl Harbor, but no sneak attack smashed these once powerful ships. They were challenged to come out and fight. VJ Day halts the redeployment of thousands of troops from Europe to the South Pacific, and the greatest American army in history begins a slow process of demobilization. Ships laden with veterans who smashed the German armies in the West pour into East Coast ports. The Saratoga, veteran of 8 major carrier actions, brings South Pacific veterans into San Francisco. Navy men, too, are coming home. And what a thrill! Five million New Yorkers turn out to celebrate Navy Day and cheer President Truman as he passes up Fifth Avenue en route to review the greatest armada of fighting ships ever assembled. Strung out for miles at anchorage in the Hudson River, the fleet thrills vast crowds of spectators thronging Riverside Drive. Here are veterans of historic naval actions, their crews saluting as the president's ship passes. And carrier planes fill the skies overhead. "21 guns from every ship in the fleet is the presidential salute. And there's the great battleship Missouri firing. Is the majestic climax to Allied victory on the 7 seas. Battle veterans of the mighty naval forces are home at last from the Atlantic, the Pacific, and all the far-flung fighting areas of the greatest war in history.